Maxim Gorky. My Childhood. Translated by Ronald Wilkes. Chapter 1. Father lay on the floor by the window of a small, darkened room, dressed in white and looking terribly long. His feet were bare and his toes were strangely splayed out. His gentle fingers, now peacefully resting on his chest, were also distorted, and the black discs of copper coins firmly sealed his once shining eyes. His kind face had darkened, and its nastily bared teeth frightened me. Mother, half naked in a red skirt, was kneeling beside him, combing his long soft hair down from the forehead to the nape of his neck with the black comb I loved to use as a saw for melon rinds. She kept muttering something in a hoarse, deep voice. Her gray eyes were swollen and seemed to be dissolving in a flood of tears. Grandmother was holding me by the hand. She was a fat, round woman with a large head, enormous eyes, and a funny, puffy nose. All black and soft, she was terribly fascinating. She was crying as well. Her voice pitched differently from Mother's, but in a way that perfectly harmonized with it. Shaking all over, she pulled and pushed me over to Father. I stubbornly resisted and tried to hide behind her, for I felt frightened and out of place there. I'd never seen grown-ups crying before and couldn't make head or tail of the words Grandmother repeated again and again. Say goodbye to your father. You won't ever see him again, dear. He died too young, before his time. I'd been very ill and had only just started walking again. During my illness, and this I remember very clearly, Father had light-heartedly played games with me and kept me amused. And then he suddenly disappeared and a new person, Grandmother, took his place. Where did you walk down from? I asked her. She answered, from up the river, from Nizhny. But I didn't walk, I came by boat. You can't walk on water. Enough of your questions now. This I found both funny and puzzling. Upstairs in the house lived two bearded Persians, while the cellar was occupied by an old, sallow-faced Kalmuk who sold sheepskins. I could slide down the banisters or somersault down if I fell off. That was an accepted fact. But what did water have to do with it? It all seemed wrong and ludicrously mixed up. And why should I be quiet? Because you've always too much to say for yourself, she said, laughing. The way she spoke was warm, cheerful, rhythmical. We became firm friends from the very first day, and now I wanted both of us to get out of that room as soon as possible. Mother's presence had a stifling effect on me, and her tears and wailing awakened an unfamiliar feeling of anxiety in me. I'd never seen her like that before. She had always been stern with me and was given to few words. She was a clean, smooth, large person, like a horse. She had a firm body and extremely strong hands, and now she looked unpleasantly swollen and disheveled. All her clothes were torn. Her hair, which was usually neatly combed into place like a large gay hat, was scattered over her bare shoulders and hung over her face, and some of it, in the form of a large plait, dangled about, touching Father's sleeping face. For all the time I'd been standing in that room, not once did she so much as look at me, but just went on combing Father's hair, choking with tears and howling continually. Some dark-skinned peasants and a local constable peered round the door. "Hurry up and get him out of here," the constable shouted angrily. A dark shawl had been used as a curtain over the window, and it swelled out like a sail. Once Father had taken me sailing, and suddenly there was a thunderclap. Father had left, pressed me firmly between his knees and shouted, "It's nothing. Don't be frightened, Alex." Suddenly, Mother lifted herself heavily from the floor, then fell down on her back, so that her hair brushed over the floor. Her unseeing, pale face had gone blue. Baring her teeth like Father's, she said in a terrifying voice, "Close the door. Get Alexei out of here." Grandmother pushed me aside as she made for the door. "Friends, don't be afraid," she cried. "Don't touch her. And go away, for Christ's sake. It's not cholera. She's in labor. Please go away." I hid in a dim corner behind a trunk and looked from there at Mother writhing over the floor, groaning and gnashing her teeth, while Grandmother crawled round her and said in a gentle, joyful voice, "In the name of the Son and the Holy Ghost, try and bear the pain, Verisha. Holy Mother of God who prays for us." I was frightened out of my wits. There they were rolling over the floor, knocking up against Father's body, groaning and shouting. He didn't move and seemed to be laughing. This went on for a long time, and several times Mother got to her feet only to fall down again. Grandmother kept rolling in and out of the room like a big black softball. Suddenly a baby cried in the darkness. "God be praised," said Grandmother. "A boy!" And she lit a candle. I must have dozed off in a corner as I don't remember anything more. Another vivid experience that stands out in my memory is a rainy day in a deserted corner of a cemetery. I stood on a slippery heap of sticky mud and looked down into the pit where my father's coffin had been lowered. At the bottom was a lot of water and a few frogs. Two of them had succeeded in climbing onto the yellow coffin lid. My grandmother, myself, a policeman who looked soaked to the skin, and two men with spades who were evidently in a very bad mood had gathered round the grave. A warm rain, as fine as delicate beads, began to fall gently on us. "Fill it in," said the policeman as he walked away. Grandmother burst into tears and hid her face in her shawl. The grave diggers, bent double, began piling the earth into the grave at great speed. Water squelched. The frogs jumped off the coffin and tried to escape up the sides, but were thrown back by clods of earth. "Let's go now, Lenya," said Grandmother as she put her hand on my shoulder. Reluctant to leave, I slipped out of her grasp. "God help us," she grumbled, not at me or even at God, and she stood by the grave for a long time, quite silent. Even when the grave had been leveled off, she still stood there. The gravediggers smacked their spades against the mud, which made them ring out with a hollow sound. A sudden gust of wind drove away the rain. Grandmother took my hand and led me to a distant church surrounded by a great number of dark crosses. "Why don't you cry?" she asked when we left the cemetery. "You ought to cry." "I don't want to," I replied. "Well, you'd better not if you don't want to," she said softly. I found this very strange. When I did cry, which wasn't often, it was usually because of some insult, and not from physical pain. My father always laughed at me, but Mother would shout, "Don't you dare cry." Afterwards, we rode in a droshky along a broad and very muddy street lined with houses painted deep red. I asked Grandmother, "Will the frogs get out?" "No, they don't stand a chance." God help them. Neither my mother nor my father ever mentioned the name of God so often and with such familiarity. A few days later, we were all traveling in a small cabin on board a steamboat. My newly born brother Maxim had died and lay on a table in the corner, wrapped up in a white sheet tied round with red ribbon. I clambered up onto the piles of luggage and trunks and looked out of the porthole, which was round and bulging like a horse's eye. Beyond the wet glass, the swirling foamy water stretched away endlessly. At times it seemed to rear up and lick the glass, making me jump back onto the floor. "Don't be frightened," said grandmother as she gently lifted me in her soft arms and put me back on the pile of luggage. A gray, damp mist hung over the water. Somewhere in the distance, a dark mass of land would loom up and then disappear. Everything around me was shaking. Only my mother, who was leaning against a wall, her hands behind her head, stood firm and steady. Her face, clouded over, grimly set, and with the eyes shut tight, was that of a blind person. Not once did she speak. She seemed to have changed into somebody else, strange and new. Even her dress was different. Grandmother asked her over and over again, in the soft voice she had, "Varia dear, try and eat something, won't you?" My mother didn't reply and remained motionless. Grandmother used to whisper to me. With my mother she raised her voice, but all the same approached her timidly and cautiously, saying very little. It struck me that she was afraid of her. This I could well understand, and I felt all the closer to my grandmother. "Saratov!" my mother exclaimed in an unexpectedly loud and angry voice. "Where's that sailor got to?" The words Saratov and sailor were very strange and foreign-sounding. A broad-shouldered, gray-haired man, dressed in blue, came into the cabin. He carried a small box. Grandmother took it from him and began to lay out my brother. When she had finished, she took the box in her outstretched arms to the door. But she was far too fat to get through the narrow doorway, except sideways, and her confusion and embarrassment made me laugh. "Oh, mother," my mother cried, and took away the coffin. They both disappeared, leaving me staring at the man in blue. "What, has your brother gone?" he said, leaning towards me. "Who are you?" "A sailor." "And who is Saratov?" "Saratov's a town. Look out of the window, there." Through the window I could see the land slipping by. It was dark and steep, and the mist rose from it in smoky rings, reminding me of a large slice of bread freshly cut from the loaf. "And where's grandmother gone?" "To bury her grandson." "Will they put him in the ground?" "Of course. How else can they bury him?" I told the sailor about the frogs buried alive with my father. He lifted me in his arms, gave me a firm hug, and kissed me. "You're too young to understand," he said. "You don't have to be sorry for the frogs. To hell with them. It's your mother you should pity. See what life's done to her." Suddenly something hooted and roared above. I knew very well that it was the ship, and I wasn't at all afraid. But the sailor hurriedly put me down on the floor and rushed off saying, "I've got to run." I wanted to run as well. I went out of the cabin. The dim, narrow gangway was empty. Near the door, copper plates glinted on the ladder steps. I looked up and saw people with knapsacks and bundles. Clearly everybody was leaving the ship, and that meant I had to go too. When I found myself in the middle of a crowd of men by the rail, just in front of the gangway, everyone started shouting at me, "Who do you belong to?" "Don't know." For a long time I was shoved around, shaken and poked. At last the gray-haired sailor appeared on the scene and seized me. "He's the boy from one of the cabins, from Astrakhan," he explained. He ran with me into the cabin, dumped me on a pile of luggage, and pointed a menacing finger at me as he left. "Don't you dare move." The noise up above gradually died down. The ship was steadily throbbing now and no longer pitched and tossed through the water. Something that looked like a wet wall shut out the light at the porthole. The cabin became dark and stuffy, and the bundles of luggage seemed to swell up, crowding me out and making me feel cramped and ill at ease. Perhaps I'd been left alone on that empty ship for good? I went at the door but couldn't budge the copper handle. I caught hold of a bottle of milk and smashed it against the handle as hard as I could. The milk drenched my legs and trickled right down to my shoes. Angry at this failure, I lay down on the luggage and softly cried, after which I fell asleep with the tears still rolling down my cheeks. When I woke up, the boat was shaking all over again and pounding through the water. Like the sun, the portholes seemed to be on fire. Grandmother was sitting near me, combing her hair and frowning as she muttered to herself. She had amazingly long hair, black streaked with blue, that reached right down to the floor, falling over her shoulders, breasts and knees. She would lift the long plaits with one hand and force a wooden comb, which only had a few teeth, through them with great difficulty. Her lips twisted and her dark eyes shone angrily, and her face, framed by that huge mass of hair, became small and comical. Today she seemed in a bad temper. But when I asked her why she had such long hair, she told me in the same soft and warm voice as yesterday, "It's one of God's ways of punishing me. It's the devil's own job combing the damn stuff out. Ever since I was a little girl I used to boast about my lion's mane. Now it's the curse of my life. Time you were asleep. It's still very early, the sun's only just risen. But I don't want to sleep." "Then don't," she agreed at once, plaiting her hair and looking at the divan where my mother lay, face upwards, taut as a violin string. "Tell me how you broke that bottle yesterday, but quietly." When she spoke, she seemed almost to sing her words, and this made them take root firmly in my memory, like flowers, soft, bright, and full of richness. When she smiled, the pupils of her dark cherry-colored eyes opened wide, blazing with a light that was too welcoming for words, and her strong white teeth were laid bare. In spite of the many wrinkles in the swarthy skin round her cheeks, her whole face suddenly became young and radiant again. What spoiled it was that puffy nose with its inflated nostrils and red tip. She took snuff, which she kept in a black box decorated with silver. A dark figure. She shone from within with a warm, cheering light. Although she had a bad stoop and was almost hunchbacked and fat into the bargain, she moved with a surprising ease and agility, like a large cat, and she was just as soft as that affectionate animal. Before she came into my life, I must have been lying asleep in a dark corner, but now she had woken me up, brought me out into the light, and bound up everything around me into a continuous thread which she wove into many-colored lace. At once she became a friend for life, nearest to my heart, and the person I treasured and understood more than anyone else. It was her unselfish love of the world that enriched me and nourished me with the strength I would need for the hard life that lay ahead. 40 years ago, steamboats moved slowly. It took us ages to reach Nizhny, and I clearly remember that time when I first experienced nature's beauty to the full. The weather had set in fair. From morning to night, I would walk with grandmother on the deck, under a cloudless sky, the banks of the Volga on either side looking like woven silk tinted with the gold of autumn. Without any hurry, slowly moving its rumbling paddles through the gray-blue water, a bright red-colored steamboat swung up the river with a barge in tow, gray, just like a wood louse. The sun moved up imperceptibly above the Volga. Every moment there was something new to look at. The scene was changing the whole time. The green hills looked like folds in the rich dress of the earth. Towns and villages lined the banks, and from a distance seemed to be made of gingerbread. Golden autumn leaves floated in the water. "Look how beautiful it is," Grandmother would exclaim as she went from one side of the boat to the other. Her face shone and her eyes were wide open with joy. She was so engrossed with looking at the bank, I might not have been there at all. She would stand at the rail, her hands folded across her breast. Then she would smile, not saying a word, and with tears in her eyes. I would pull at her dark flower-patterned skirt. "What?" she would say with a start. I must have dozed off. "It's all like a dream." "Why are you crying?" "Because I'm so happy, dear, and so old," she said, smiling. "I'm an old woman. I've seen more than 60 years, just torn past they have." After a pinch of snuff, she would begin her wonderful stories about good robbers, saints, and all kinds of wild animals and evil spirits. She would tell these stories in a soft, mysterious voice, her face turned towards me. Her wide-open eyes would stare into mine as if she were pouring strength straight into my heart, which uplifted me. She seemed to sing the stories to me, and the longer she went on, the more harmonious and flowing the words became. Listening to her was the most marvelous experience. I would sit there and then ask her more. It was like this. An old goblin was sitting by the fire when he got a splinter of vermicelli in his hand. He rocked to and fro with pain and whined, "Oh, little mice, I can't stand the pain." She would lift her leg up high, grip it and shake it, comically wrinkling up her face as if she were in pain herself. Some bearded sailors were standing by us. All of them looked very kind, and they applauded and laughed as they listened to Grandmother's stories. "Now, Grandma, let's have some more," they kept on asking. Then they said, "Come and have a bite with us." They gave Grandmother vodka, and I was treated to watermelons and cantaloupes. These had to be eaten secretly, for there was a man on board who forbade anyone to eat fruit, and if he found any would take it away and throw it into the river. He was dressed like a policeman, with brass buttons on his uniform, and he was always drunk. Everyone hid when they saw him coming. My mother rarely went on deck and never came near us. She said nothing all the time we were on the boat. Her large, shapely body, her dark, emotionless face, her heavy crown of bright, plaited hair, her firmness and strength, all this I can picture now as though I were seeing her through a mist or a transparent cloud, from which her gray eyes, large as Grandmother's, peered out coldly and distantly. Once she said sternly, "People are always laughing at you, Mama." "Let them," answered Grandmother in an unconcerned voice. "Let them laugh. It's good for them." I remember Grandmother's childlike joy when she first saw Nizni. Holding me by the hand, she pulled me to the rail and cried, "Just look. It's so beautiful. Nizni, what a city. Can you see those churches there? They seem to be flying through the air." She was near to tears as she asked Mother, "Verisha, why don't you come and have a look?" just for a moment. Cheer up now. Mother produced a gloomy smile. When the boat dropped anchor opposite the beautiful city, in the middle of a river crowded with boats and bristling with hundreds of pointed masts, a large rowing boat full of people came alongside and hooked onto the lowered rope ladder. One by one the people climbed up. In front of everyone else was a small, shriveled-looking old man in long black clothes and with a beard of tarnished gold. He had a nose like a bird's beak and small green eyes, and he climbed rapidly to the top of the ladder. "Father," my mother cried in a loud, deep voice and flung herself into his arms. He seized her head, swiftly stroked her cheeks with his small reddish hands and screeched, "And how's my silly girl? Eh? Now, you've come at last." Grandmother managed to embrace and kiss everyone at once, and she spun round like a propeller. She pushed me forwards and said hurriedly, "Move yourself now. This is Uncle Mikhail, and this is Uncle Yakov, Auntie Natalia, and these are your cousins, both called Sasha, and your cousin Katerina. It's a big family." Grandfather said to her, "Are you well?" They kissed each other 3 times. Grandfather hauled me away from the thick mob and asked me, holding me by the head, "And who might you be?" "I'm from Astrakhan, from the cabin." "What's he talking about?" Grandfather said to Mother. Without giving me time to reply, he pushed me to one side and said, "He's got his father's cheekbones. Get into the boat." We reached the shore, and we all went up the hill along a road made of large cobbles, high embankments overgrown with rank trampled grass lining it on either side. Grandfather and Mother led the way. Grandfather only came up to her shoulder, and he took small, mincing steps while Mother glanced down at him and seemed to glide through the air. My uncles followed silently, Mikhail with his sleek black hair and the same withered look as grandfather, and Yakov, his hair bright and curly. Then came some fat women in gay dresses, and 6 children, all older than me and all very subdued. I walked with grandmother and my little Aunt Natalia, pale-faced, blue-eyed, with an enormous belly. She stopped every now and again and panted for breath. "I can't go any further," she complained. "Why did they have to bring you along?" Grandmother mumbled angrily. "They've got no sense at all." I didn't like the grown-ups, nor the children, and I felt completely and utterly lost in their company. Even grandmother seemed to recede into the background and became a stranger to me. I took a particular dislike to grandfather, immediately sensing he was an enemy. For this reason I watched him closely, taking care lest my curiosity led me into danger. We reached the end of the path. At the very top, leaning against the embankment on the right, and the very first house in the street, stood a squat, single-storied house painted dirty pink, with a roof hanging low over its bulging windows like a hat pulled down. From the street it looked very big, but inside its dim little rooms it was very cramped. Angry people rushed about in all directions like passengers about to disembark from a ship. Ragged children swarmed all over the place like thieving sparrows, and the whole house was filled with a strange pungent smell. I stood outside in the yard, which was just as unpleasant. All around it hung huge wet rags, and it was full of tubs containing oily-looking water, all different colors. Pieces of cloth were being dipped into them. In one corner, under a ramshackle lean-to, wood burnt fiercely in a stove. I could hear water boiling and bubbling, and someone I couldn't see was shouting, very loudly. These strange words: sandalwood, magenta, vitriol. Chapter 2. And there began a new life, infinitely strange and varied, in which the days rushed by at terrifying speed. Now I see it as a grim story, the creation of a sincere artist with a passionate devotion to the truth, however cruel. As I try to bring the past to life, I find it hard to believe that it all really happened. That dreary life was so full of violence that I would even like to question or gloss over much of it. But truth is nobler than self-pity, and in fact I am not writing about myself alone, but about that close-knit, suffocating little world of pain and suffering where the ordinary Russian man in the street used to live, and where he lives to this day. Grandfather's house was filled with a choking fog of mutual hostility. It poisoned the grown-ups and even infected the children. Later on, Grandmother told me that Mother had arrived just at the time her brothers were continually pestering her father to divide up the estate. Mother's unexpected return only sharpened their desire to get what they thought was their rightful share. They were afraid that Mother would ask for a dowry, to which she was entitled, but which Grandfather had withheld because, as he put it, she had gone her own way and married against his wishes. My uncles thought the dowry should go to them. For a long time they had been having long and violent arguments as to which of them should open a dye works, in the town or across the Oka River in the Cunavino district. Soon after our arrival, a fierce quarrel started in the kitchen. The uncles, without any warning, suddenly leaped to their feet, leaned across the table, and started howling and roaring at Grandfather, shaking themselves and baring their teeth like dogs. Grandfather retaliated by banging his soup spoon on the table. Then he went red in the face and screeched like a cock, "I'll cut you all off without a penny." Her face twisted with pain. Grandmother said, "Let them have the lot, then they'll leave you alone." "Shut up! I know you're on their side," roared Grandfather, his eyes flashing. I thought it very strange that someone so small could make such a deafening noise. Mother left the table slowly, went over to the window, and turned her back on everyone. Suddenly Uncle Mikhail gave his brother a backhander on the face. The injured brother howled with pain, started grappling with Uncle Mikhail, and they both rolled around the floor, groaning and swearing. The children started crying. Aunt Natalia, who was pregnant at the time, gave a despairing moan. Mother took hold of her behind the arms and dragged her off somewhere. Yevgenia, our nanny, a cheerful, pock-faced woman, chased the children out of the kitchen. Tables were sent flying. Tsiganok, a young broad-shouldered apprentice in the dye works, sat himself astride Uncle Mikhail's back while our foreman, Grigory Ivanovich, who was bald, had a beard and wore black glasses, calmly bound his arms with a towel. Uncle Mikhail groaned terribly as he stuck his neck out and rubbed his black beard on the floor. Grandfather ran round the table miserably shrieking, "Call yourself brothers, your own flesh and blood." Right at the beginning of the battle I had taken fright and leaped up onto the shelf over the stove. From this place of refuge I looked down with amazement at Grandmother washing the blood from Uncle Yakov's cut face with water from a copper basin. My uncle was crying and stamping his feet, while Grandmother said wearily, "Savages, that's what you are. Take a grip on yourselves." Grandfather pulled his torn shirt over his shoulders and bellowed at her, "Old bitch. It's wild animals you've given me, not sons." When Uncle Yakov had gone, Grandmother crept into a corner. She was shaking like a leaf and howling, "Holy Mother of God, please make my children see reason." Grandfather stood at her side, surveyed the table, which was littered with a mess of smashed crockery and overturned dishes, and said quietly, "Mind they don't work for Vara to death. Anything that's decent they'll drag down into the dirt. For God's sake, stop talking like that. Let's have your shirt and I'll patch it up." She squeezed his head between her open palms and kissed him on the forehead. He looked so small next to her and his face bumped against her shoulder. "That's all I can do now. Divide it between them. Yes, that's what you've got to do." They went on talking for a long time. At first it was friendly, but then Grandfather started scraping his foot over the floor, like a cock impatient for the fight. And he poked his finger threateningly at Grandmother and whispered, loud enough for me to hear, "Don't I know you by now? You feel more for them, that dear little Jesuit Mishka of yours. As for Yashka, he's nothing more than a Freemason. You'll see, they'll drink it all away." I turned clumsily on my perch on the stove and knocked an iron over. It clattered down the small ladder and fell into the sink with a loud splash. Grandfather sprang onto the ladder, hauled me down and stared me straight in the eyes as if he'd never seen me before. "Who put you up there?" "Your mother." "I went up myself." "You're lying." "No, I'm not. I was frightened." He pushed me aside, giving me a gentle slap on the forehead, just like his father. "Clear off. I was only too glad to get out of that kitchen." I could see all too clearly that Grandfather was in the habit of following me with his clever, sharp-sighted green eyes, and for this I was afraid of him. I can remember that I was forever trying to hide from those all-devouring eyes. To me, Grandfather was a wicked person. He was sarcastic and offensive whenever he spoke to anyone, and always trying to provoke people. "Oh, what a lot," he would often exclaim. That long drawn-out "oh" never failed to make me feel depressed and cold all over. In the afternoon tea break, when Grandfather, my uncles, and the workmen came into the kitchen from the dyeing shop, tired out, with hands reddened by sandalwood and burned with vitriol, and their hair tied up in ribbons, so they all looked like the rather sinister icons in the kitchen corner, at that dangerous hour Grandfather would come and sit opposite me and make all the other children jealous by giving most of his attention to me. He had a sharp-edged, angular appearance, finely molded and well-proportioned. His embroidered satin waistcoat was old and threadbare, and his cotton shirt all crumpled. His trousers sported large patches at the knees, but in spite of this he looked well-dressed, cleaner, and smarter than his sons, with their jackets, false shirt fronts, and silk cravats. Not long after our arrival, he made me learn my prayers by heart. The other children were older and already learning how to read and write with the deacon from the Church of the Assumption. Its golden dome could be seen from our windows. Aunt Natalia used to give me lessons at home. She was a timid, quietish woman with a face like a child's, and eyes so transparent I always imagined I could see right through them to the back of her head. I loved to gaze into her eyes for a long time without turning away or blinking. This made her screw up her eyes, move her head away, and ask in a voice almost as soft as a whisper, "Please repeat after me, 'Our Father, which art in heaven.'" If I asked, "What does art mean?" she would look round in fright and say sternly, "Don't you ask now. That only makes it worse. Just repeat after me, 'Our Father.'" "Well, Why asking questions should make things worse worried me. The word art took on a mysterious meaning, and I repeated it wrongly whenever I had the chance. Which part, which heart, and so on. But my aunt, so pale she seemed to be fading away, would patiently correct me. Now just you say, which art, She seemed as difficult to understand as the words she was trying to teach me. This annoyed me, and made it hard work for me to memorize my prayers. One day grandfather asked, "Well, what you been up to today?" "Playing in the street, I bet." "I can see from the bump on your forehead. It's not clever getting mixed up in fights. Can you recite the Lord's Prayer?" My aunt said in her soft voice, "He's got a bad memory." Grandfather laughed and cheerily raised his reddish eyebrows. "In that case, he deserves a good hiding." He turned to me again and asked, "Did your father beat you?" Not understanding what he was talking about, I didn't reply, and Mother intervened. "No, Maxim never beat him, and he didn't let me either." "Why not?" "He used to say it never did any good." What a fool he was, that Maxim. God forgive me for speaking ill of the dead. These words were spoken in an angry, clipped voice. They deeply hurt me, and grandfather noticed it. "Stop sulking. You should see yourself." He stroked his silvery red hair and added, "On Saturday I'm going to flog Sashka." "Because of the thimble." "What's flogging?" I asked. Everyone laughed and grandfather said, "Just you wait and see." As I hid in my corner, I thought, flogging must mean the same as unstitching cloth before it's dyed. Whipping and beating mean the same. Horses, cats, and dogs are beaten, and an Astrakhan policeman beat the Persians. I'd seen it with my own eyes. But I'd never seen small children treated in this way, and although grandfather used to smack the others on the head or neck, it never seemed to worry them at all. And all they did was scratch the place afterwards. More than once I asked them, "Did it hurt?" And they always courageously replied, "No, didn't feel nothing." I was acquainted with every detail of the tempestuous thimble story. One evening, about an hour before supper, the uncles and the foreman were sewing up pieces of dyed material into one length and pinning cardboard labels on it. Deciding to play a joke on Grigory, who was half blind, Uncle Mikhail told his 9-year-old nephew to heat Grigory's thimble over a candle. Sasha gripped the thimble and some pincers used for snuffing the candles, waited until it was red hot, put it down near Grigory's hand without him seeing, and hid behind the stove. At that moment who should come in but grandfather, who sat down and put his finger in the red-hot thimble. I remember escaping from the uproar into the kitchen and seeing grandfather clutching his ear with his burnt fingers and comically hopping and shouting, "What infidel did that?" Uncle Mikhail, bent over the table, was chasing the thimble with his finger and blowing on it. Grigory went on sewing as if nothing had happened. Shadows from the fire flickered over his vast bald head. Uncle Yakov ran to see if he could help, then hid behind the stove, where he laughed quietly to himself. Grandmother took a moist potato and began grating it. "It's Sasha's work," Uncle Mikhail said suddenly. "That's a lie," retorted Uncle Yakov, springing out from his hiding place. In one corner his son could be heard crying and protesting, "Papa, don't believe him. He told me to do it." The uncles started swearing at each other. All at once grandfather calmed down, pressed the bits of potato to his finger, and left the room without saying a word, taking me with him by the scruff of the neck. Everyone blamed Uncle Mikhail. My question during tea, would he get a flogging, was perfectly natural in the circumstances. He deserves it, snarled grandfather, looking at me out of the corner of his eye. Uncle Mikhail thumped the table and shouted to Mother, "If you don't take that brat of yours out of here, I'll bash his face in." "Just you lay a finger on him," replied Mother. No one said a word. Mother had a knack of using short words as defensive weapons for warding off people, repelling them, and making them feel powerless. It was obvious to me everyone was afraid of her. Even grandfather spoke to her differently and in a more subdued voice. This pleased me, and I used to boast about it to my cousins. My mother's strongest. And they didn't dispute it. But an event that took place the following Saturday completely changed my attitude to Mother. By then I had managed to get myself into serious trouble. The skill with which the grown-ups made the cloth change color used to intrigue me very much. They would take a yellow piece of cloth and soak it in black water, and it would come out deep blue, or indigo as it was called. Then they would rinse out a gray piece in rusty-colored water, and it came out Bordeaux claret. It was all so simple and mystifying. I wanted to try my hand at dyeing as well and told Uncle Yakov Sasha about it. He was a serious boy. Always tried to please the grown-ups, was polite to everyone and ready to do whatever anyone asked of him. The grown-ups praised his intelligence and obedience, but grandfather would squint at him and say, "You little crawler." Thin and swarthy-faced, and with eyes bulging like a crab's, Sasha spoke quickly, softly, and the words seemed to choke him. He was always looking around furtively, which made one think he was on the point of dashing off to hide somewhere. The hazel pupils of his eyes only moved when he got excited, and then they moved in unison with the whites. I didn't like him at all. I far preferred the lazy Sasha, Uncle Mikhail's son. He was a quiet boy with sad eyes and a pleasant smile whom I didn't see much of, and who was the image of his sweet, gentle mother. He had ugly protruding teeth that grew in a double row in the upper jaw. This worried him a great deal, and he was perpetually fingering them and trying to pull out the back row. He would let anybody touch them. This was the only interesting thing about him. He lived alone in a house crammed from top to bottom with people. During the day he loved to sit in a dark corner, and in the evenings he moved over to the window. I liked to sit close to him, neither of us speaking for a whole hour, and watching the black crows circling and wheeling in the red evening sky around the golden cupolas of the Church of the Assumption, diving down to earth and draping the fading sky with a black net. Then off they would fly, leaving utter emptiness. A scene like this fills the heart with sweet sadness and leaves you content to say nothing. On the other hand, Uncle Yakov Sasha could discourse at length and with the authority of an adult. When he discovered I wanted to become a dyer, he told me to get the white tablecloth, which was used for special occasions, and dye it blue. "White's always easiest, and I should know," he said in a very serious tone. I pulled the tablecloth out, ran into the yard with it. But no sooner had I dropped it into the indigo tub than Tsiganok pounced on me, hauled it out, squeezed it with his broad hands, and shouted to my cousin who had followed me out of the house to supervise the work, "Call grandmother at once." He shook his black, disheveled hair ominously and said, "You'll cop it for this." Grandmother came running, groaned, even burst into tears, and started to scold me with quaint, comical expressions. "You no good from perm, blockhead. I've a good mind to drop you in one of the tubs." Then she began exhorting Siganok, "Vanya, don't dare tell grandfather, whatever you do. I won't say anything and perhaps no one will find out." Vanya said anxiously, wiping his wet hands on his many-colored apron, "It's nothing to do with me, but I won't say anything." "I'll keep him quiet with a few coppers," said grandmother as she led me into the house. On Saturday, just before evening prayers, someone took me to the kitchen, where it was dark and quiet. I clearly remember lots of doors shut tight, and beyond the windows, the misty grayness of an autumn night and the dull sound of rain. On a broad bench in front of the black-mouthed stove sat my friend Siganok, hardly recognizable. Grandfather stood in the corner by the sink, picking out long twigs from a bucket full of water. He measured them, bound them up, and made them whistle through the air. Somewhere in the darkness, grandmother noisily took her snuff and grumbled, "Leave him be, you butcher." Sasha Yakovov, who was sitting on a chair in the middle of the kitchen, rubbed his eyes with his fists and said in a drawling voice that sounded more like an old beggar's than his own, "For Christ's sake, forgive him, shoulder to shoulder, like tree trunks." Uncle Mikhail's children, brother and sister, stood on the far side of the table. "I'll forgive him when I've finished," said grandfather, laying a long wet twig across his hand. "Right. Take your trousers off." He said this calmly, and neither the sound of his voice nor the noise of the children leaning on the creaky table, not even grandmother scraping her feet along the floor, broke that memorable silence in the gloomy kitchen beneath a smoke-blackened ceiling. Sasha got up, undid his trousers, let them down to his knees, and managed to keep them from falling right down with his hands. Bent double, he stumbled across to the bench. It wasn't a pleasant sight, and my legs shook in sympathy. But worse was to come when he lay on the bench like a lamb for the slaughter, face downwards, with a wide talvanka tied him to it round the armpits and neck, stooped over him and gripped his ankles with his black hands. "Come a bit closer, Alexei," grandfather called. "Did you hear me? Now you'll see what I mean by flogging." One, he swung his hand, not very high, and brought the twigs down hard on bare flesh. Sasha gave a piercing scream. "Liar," said grandfather. "That didn't hurt. Try this for size." He struck him so violently that the skin became inflamed at once and a red stripe appeared. My cousin howled continually. "Isn't that delightful?" grandfather inquired, raising and dropping his arm at regular intervals. "Don't you like it? It's in payment for the thimble." When he swung his arm up or down, my heart rose and fell exactly in time. Sasha screamed in a revolting, delicate little voice, "I won't do it again." "I told you about it, didn't I?" I confessed, calmly, as though he were reading from the Psalter. Grandfather said, "Telling tales is no excuse. Informers should be punished first. That's for the tablecloth." Grandmother rushed towards me and seized me in her arms. She cried, "I won't let you take Alexei. I won't, you monster." She started kicking at the door and called out, "Varya, Varvara." Grandfather fell upon her, knocked her off her feet, snatched me away from her, and carried me to the bench. I struggled, pulled his red beard, bit his finger. He roared, squeezed me, and finally threw me on the bench so that I cut my face open. I still remember his wild cry, "Tie him up. I'll kill him." And I remember, too, Mother's pale face with its enormous eyes. She ran the length of the bench gasping, "Papa, let him go. Please don't." Grandfather flogged me until I was unconscious, and for several days I was very ill. I lay in a wide, stuffy bed, face downwards, in a little room with one window. In one corner, in front of a case crammed full of icons, burnt an everlasting lamp. These days of sickness were very important for my future development, and during them I must have grown up a lot. I began to experience a totally new kind of feeling. From now onwards, my concern for others never let me rest for a moment, and, just as if my heart had been laid bare, I became almost intolerably sensitive to any insult or physical pain, whether I or someone else was the victim. A quarrel between mother and grandmother made more impression on me at this time than anything else. There was grandmother, looking huge and black in that cramped room, angrily pushing mother into the corner where the icons were. "Why didn't you take him away?" she hissed. I was frightened. "A healthy woman like you. You should be ashamed of yourself." "I'm an old woman and I wouldn't have been afraid. Shame on you. Leave me alone. I feel sick. You don't love him. He's an orphan and you don't feel any pity." Mother said in a loud, weary voice, "What about me? I'll be an orphan for the rest of my life." For a long time they sat crying on the chest in the corner. Mother said, "If it weren't for Alexei, I'd leave here. I can't live in this hell, I haven't the strength." "My own flesh and blood, my angel," whispered grandmother. Mother wasn't very strong, and, like everyone else, was afraid of grandfather. Because of me, she couldn't leave the house, where life was unbearable for her. It was all very depressing. But soon mother did in fact disappear, and she went to stay with some friends. Suddenly, as if he'd jumped down from the ceiling, grandfather appeared, sat on my bed, and felt my head with a hand as cold as ice. "Good morning, sir. Now, answer me, and don't be angry. How are you?" All I wanted was to kick him, but the least movement was painful. His hair looked redder than ever before. He shook his head restlessly, and his bright eyes seemed to be looking for something on the wall. He took out of his pocket a piece of gingerbread, 2 sugar cakes, an apple, a little branch with blue raisins, and put them all on the pillow, just by my nose. "Look, I've brought you some presents." He leant over and kissed me on the forehead. Then he started talking to me, stroking my head with his small, rough hand covered all over in yellow dye, especially the deformed, bird-like nails. "I've been very hard with you, but you lost your temper. You bit and scratched me and made me lose mine. It won't hurt you if you got more than you deserved. I'll count it as part payment for the future. You must remember that when someone of your own flesh and blood beats you, it's for your own good and should never be considered an injustice." Do you think I was never thrashed? I got such beatings, the like you'd never see even in a nightmare. I was so badly treated that God would have wept to see it. And what good did it do me? I was an orphan with a beggar for a mother, and in spite of that I got where I am now, a freeman. A member of the guild, a leader of men. He leaned up against me with his thin, finely built body, and began to tell me about his childhood in vigorous meaty words which he strung together with great skill and ease. His green eyes burst into bright flames. His reddish-gold hair bristled as he deepened his voice and trumpeted right into my face, so you came on a boat with steam to help it along. When I was your age, I fought against the Volga, pulling a barge which was in the water, and I had to struggle on my own along the bank, barefooted, walking over sharp stones and rocks, right from dawn to dusk. The sun scorched the back of your neck, and your head seemed to boil like molten steel. And you, miserable wretch, bent double, your bones creaking, press on and on. Till you don't see where you're going anymore, you're blinded by sweat, and your soul weeps and a tear rolls down your cheek. That was a life. On and on you'd go. Then tumble free from the hauling rope, flat on your mug and glad of it. Work like that sapped all your strength, and all you wanted was rest. That's how we lived, with Jesus Christ smiling down on us. I measured out Mother Volga 3 times. From Simbirsk to Rybinsk, from Saratov to here, from Astrakhan to Makaryev, right to the fair. And that's a lot of miles. For years later, I was a water pumper, and I soon showed my boss how smart I was. He talked very quickly and swelled like a cloud in front of me, changing from a small, thin old man into someone of fabulous strength, just him against the river with his huge gray barge. Often he would jump from the bed and wave his hands about to show me how the barge haulers were harnessed with ropes, how they pumped the water out. In a bass voice he sang to me, then leaped on the bed like a young man and once more fascinated me with his racy, vigorous stories. And then, Eliasha, when we got to a resting place on a summer evening in Ziguli. Somewhere at the foot of a green hill, we'd light fires and heat up some cabbage soup. Then one of us, crossed in love perhaps, would sing a heart-rending song that made you go cold all over, and the Volga seemed to flow faster, just like a horse rearing up right to the clouds. And all our grief seemed like dust before the wind. We used to get so carried away that the pot would boil over and the cook would get it in the neck. Always keep your mind on the job, I say. Several times someone poked his head round the door and called grandfather, but I said imploringly, "Don't go." He would laugh and wave everyone away. "I won't be long." He would go on telling his stories until the evening, and when he left, after an affectionate farewell, I realized grandfather was not wicked or terrifying. And then it was terribly hard for me to remember that he had beaten me so cruelly, but all the same, I was never to forget it. Grandfather's visit opened the door to the whole household, and from morning till evening there was usually someone sitting by the bed, doing all they could to amuse me. But their efforts weren't always successful. Grandmother was my most frequent visitor. She shared the same bed. But the one who left the most vivid impression on me was Tsiganok. With his huge square shoulders, broad chest, and enormous curly head, he came to visit me one evening, gaily dressed, as if he were off to a party, in a golden, silky shirt, velvet trousers and boots that squeaked like a harmonica. His hair shone, his squinting eyes sparkled merrily under his thick eyebrows, and his white teeth gleamed beneath the black stripe of his young mustache. His shirt, gently reflecting the red flame of the icon lamp, seemed to be on fire. "Just you look," he said as he raised his sleeve to show me his bare arm, which was covered up to the elbow in red scars. "See how it's swollen. They've almost healed now. You should have seen them before. Like to know what happened? In comes your grandfather in a blind rage, and I see him start on you. So I put my arm between you and the whip, hoping it would break. So that grandfather would have to go and get another one, and your grandmother or mother could have dragged you to safety. But no, the twigs didn't break as the water made them too supple. Even so, I saved you from some of the strokes. You can see from the scars how many. I can be really crafty when it comes to it. He broke out into a silky laugh, looked again at his swollen arm and said, still laughing, "You don't know how sorry I was for you." It fair choked me. But the way he lay about you with that whip. He snorted like a horse, tossed his head, and started saying something about grandfather that at once warmed me by its childlike simplicity. I told him I was very fond of him, and he gave me an answer I shall never forget. But I'm very fond of you. Do you think I'd have taken all that punishment if I wasn't? Do you think I'd have done that for anyone else? To hell with anyone else. He lowered his voice, looked every now and again at the door, and gave me the following lesson. When you get another beating, mind you don't tense your body, understand? It hurts twice as much if you do that. Relax, let your muscles go so you're all soft, like a piece of jelly. And don't hold your breath back. Breathe out as hard as you can. Shout blue murder. Now remember what I'm telling you. I asked, will they flog me again? What do you think? Siganok said calmly, of course they will. Hundreds of times more. What for? Grandfather'll find some excuse. Then, with an anxious look in his eyes, he continued the lesson. When he brings the twigs straight down, lie quiet and relaxed. But if he hits you sideways on, to tear the skin off, wriggle towards him and try and follow the direction of the birch. Then it's much easier to bear. Winking with his dark, squinting eye, he said, I know more about this kind of thing than a policeman. You could make a pair of leather gloves from all the skin I've lost. I peered into his cheerful face and called to mind grandmother's stories about Prince Ivan and Ivanishka the idiot. Chapter 3. When I was well again, it became clear that Siganok occupied a very special place in the household. Grandfather didn't shout at him so often and so angrily as he did at his sons, and when he wasn't there would screw up his eyes, shake his head, and say, my Ivankus got hands of gold. Mark my words, he's made of very fine stuff. The uncles were also very friendly and kind to Siganok, and never played jokes on him as they did with Grigory, devising some malicious, nasty trick to play on him every evening. They used to heat the handles of his scissors, or stick a nail with the point upwards on his chair, or, taking advantage of his blindness, would give him bits of cloth, all differently colored, to sew up into one length, which made grandfather swear and curse at him. Once, when he was having an after-supper nap in the kitchen, on the shelf over the stove, someone dyed his face red, and for a long time he could be seen walking around, a ludicrous and terrifying figure. The lenses of his dark spectacles showed up dully against his gray beard, and his long purple nose drooped dejectedly like a tongue. The ingenuity of my uncles in thinking up fresh torments was apparently inexhaustible, but Grigory bore it all silently, and only rarely did he show signs of pain by crying out weakly. Before he touched anything made of steel, like an iron or a pair of scissors or a thimble, he would liberally smear his fingers with saliva. This became a habit with him, and even at the supper table, before taking his knife or fork, he would slobber all over his fingers, much to the amusement of the children. When his fingers got burned, his face became a sea of ripples that flowed over his forehead and eyebrows, and vanished mysteriously in his bare skull. I don't remember how grandfather felt about the way his sons amused themselves, but grandmother would shake her fist at them and shout, "Ought to be ashamed of yourselves, wicked beasts." The uncles would discuss Siganok angrily behind his back, sneering at him, criticizing his work, calling him a thief and an idler. I asked grandmother why they carried on like this. Always ready and willing to make everything clear to me, she began to explain. Both of them want to have Ivan working for them when they open their own dye works. That's why they're always pretending to find fault with him, and they make sure the other notices. They call him a bad workman, but they're lying, and it's all part of their cunning. They're afraid they'll lose Ivan to your grandfather. And your grandfather's very used to having his own way. He's thinking of opening a third dyeing works with Ivanka, which wouldn't do the uncles any good. Do you see? She laughed softly. They're up to their tricks all the time. Why, they'd even make a fool of God. But grandfather can see through their cunning and teases Yasha in front of Misha on purpose. I'm going to buy Ivan his military exemption, he says, so he won't have to go into the army. I need him. This makes them angry, as that's the last thing they want. And they're worried about the money. It costs a fortune to buy someone out of the army. Now I was living with grandmother again, as I did on the boat, and every night before I went to sleep she told me stories about fairies, or about her life, which was just like a fairy story. When it came to family matters, such as the sharing out of the inheritance or grandfather's wanting to buy a new house for himself, she spoke half mockingly, indifferently, as if she had no personal interest and were only a neighbor and not the second eldest in the family. I found out from her that Siganok was a foundling one rainy night in early spring. They found him on a bench by the front door. There he was, tucked up in an apron, grandmother said in a pensive, mysterious voice. He was so numb with cold he could hardly raise a whimper. Why did they leave him at the front door? His mother had no milk and couldn't feed him. She happened to know that a newly born child had died recently in the neighborhood, so she left hers in its place. She stopped speaking, scratched her head, sighed at the ceiling, and went on. Poverty is worse than anything, Alexei. And a lot of what I've seen I couldn't even describe to you. It's considered shameful for an unmarried girl to have a baby. Grandfather wanted to take Ivan to the police station, but I talked him out of it. I said, let's keep him. God has sent him to replace those we lost. And I had 18. If they'd all lived, there would have been enough to fill a whole street, imagine. 18 houses. I was married at 14 and had a baby when I was 15. But God took such a liking to my children, he kept taking them to be his angels. Oh, how happy it makes me feel, and how sad. As she sat on the edge of my bed, wearing nothing except a shift, her long black hair falling over her shoulders. She looked so huge and shaggy she reminded me of the bear the bearded forester from Surgak had brought into the yard a few days before. When she crossed her snowy white breast she laughed softly and shook all over. The good Lord took the best for himself. Ivanka brought me much joy. How I love little children. Well, we took Siganok into the house and had him christened, and he wanted for nothing. At first I called him Beetle, because he droned just like one. Crawling around and droning so loud we could hear him all over the house. Try and give him some love, he's a simple soul. This required no effort, and I marveled at everything he did with blind devotion. Every Saturday, when grandfather had meted out the floggings due to all the children who had committed some offense during the previous week and had gone off to evening service, a new kind of life, entertaining beyond description, came into being in the kitchen. Siganok would catch some cockroaches behind the stove, quickly make a harness from cotton threads, cut some sleigh runners from a piece of paper, and there, across the yellow, clean scrubbed table a coach, and 4 would gallop. Ivan guiding the black steeds with a thin sliver of wood and shouting excitedly, "They're off to fetch the Archbishop." Then he would glue a tiny scrap of paper to the back of a cockroach and send it in pursuit of the sleigh, explaining, "They've forgotten the mail bag. The monk's got it and is trying to catch them up." He tied the legs of another cockroach with a thread so that it stumbled along, its head twitching. Vanka shouted at it and clapped his hands. The deacon's just leaving the pub for evening prayers. He would show us his little mice, which he had trained to stand and walk on their hind legs, dragging their long tails behind them, and blinking their bright black beady eyes comically. He was very careful how he handled his mice, carried them inside his coat, and fed them with sugar from his own mouth. He used to kiss them and say persuasively, "A mouse is a very clever and affectionate animal to have around, and hobgoblins are very fond of them. It brings you good luck if you're kind to them." He could do tricks with cards and money, could shout louder than all the children, and in every way was one of us. Once, when the children were playing cards with him, he was donkey several times running, became very depressed as a result, sat sulking to show how offended he was and threw his cards down. Afterwards he complained to me, his nose twitching angrily, "You don't have to tell me it was all fixed." They winked signals to each other and passed cards under the table. Do you call that a game? I couldn't cheat better if I tried. He was 19 and was bigger than all 4 of us put together. I particularly remember him from those festive evenings. When grandfather and Uncle Mikhail went visiting, Uncle Yakov would appear in the kitchen with a guitar, his curly hair disheveled. Grandmother would prepare some savories and bring out the vodka bottle, which was all green, with red flowers cleverly worked from glass on the bottom, dressed for the occasion. Siganok would spin around like a top. Grigory would creep in sideways, his dark glasses flashing. In would come our nanny, Yevgenia, a pockmarked girl, red-skinned and fat as a jug, with cunning eyes and a trumpet of a voice. Sometimes the hairy deacon from the Church of the Assumption would join us, and some other mysterious people, who looked slippery as eels or pikes. They all breathed heavily from excessive eating and drinking. The children were given presents, a glass each of some sweet liquid, and gradually the merrymakers became inflamed with an uninhibited but strange gaiety. Uncle Yakov would start tuning his guitar with loving care, and when this was done, would always say, "Right, here goes," tossing back his curly head. He would bend over the guitar and stretch out his neck like a goose. His tranquil face took on a sleepy look, and his lively, elusive eyes would lose their fire in an oily haze. He would gently pluck the strings and play a tune so infectious that you couldn't help standing up. His music demanded complete silence. It flowed away somewhere in the distance like a rushing torrent, seeping through the floor and the walls, stirring the heart and arousing a strange sensation of melancholy and uneasiness, which I found hard to understand. The music made you feel sorry for yourself and everyone else. Under its influence, the grown-ups became like children, and everyone sat motionless, lost in thoughtful silence. Sasha Mikhailov was a particularly attentive listener. The whole time he leant towards where his uncle was sitting and looked at the guitar, his mouth wide open, so that saliva trickled down over his lip. Frequently, he was so carried away that he slipped off his chair onto the floor, his hands thrust forward to break his fall. When this happened, he would stay just where he landed, his eyes bulging with a lifeless stare, and everyone grew stiff as if a spell had been cast on them. Only the samovar hummed softly, but didn't interfere with the guitar's lament. The square outlines of the two windows in the room peered out into the gloom of the autumn night, and now and again someone knocked softly on them. The yellow flames of the two tallow candles, sharp-pointed like spears, flickered on the table. Uncle Yakov fell deeper and deeper into a kind of stupor. With his teeth clenched, he seemed to be sound asleep. Only his hands had any life in them. The bent fingers of his right hand trembled together over the dark plectrum, like a bird fluttering and beating its wings. The fingers of his left hand tore over the fingerboard almost too fast for the eye to see. When he'd had a few drinks, he almost never failed to produce an endless song which he sang through his teeth with a nasty whistling sound. If Yakov were a dog, he would howl from morning to night. "Oh, I'm so bored. Oh, I'm so sad." The nun walks along the street and the cow sits on the fence. "Oh, I'm so bored." The cricket chirps behind the stove and the cockroaches scurry about. "Oh, I'm so bored." The beggar hung his trousers to dry, and along came another and stole them. "Oh, I'm so sad. Oh, I'm so bored." This was too much for me, and when Uncle began to sing about tramps, I burst into a wild sobbing, unable to control my feelings. Tsiganok listened to the music with the same rapt attention as the others, running his fingers through his thick black hair as he looked into a corner and sniffed. Now and again he would suddenly exclaim in a plaintive voice, "Ah, if only I had a voice like that. How I should sing." Grandmother sighed and said, "You'll break your heart one of these days, Yasha. Vanya, let's have a dance." Her requests weren't always immediately carried out, but usually the guitarist would suddenly press the palm of his hand against the strings for 1 second, then clench his fist and with a wild sweep pretend to throw something invisible and soundless onto the floor, shouting vigorously, "Away with sadness. Vanka, get up." Tsiganok would smarten himself up, straighten his shirt, and very carefully, as if he were walking over nails, take up his place in the middle of the kitchen. His tan cheeks were flushed, and he asked with an awkward smile, "A little faster, Yakov." Frenzied twangings came from the guitar, heels thumped on the floor. The plates and dishes on the table and in the cupboard clattered. There, in the middle of the kitchen, was the fiery Tsiganok, rushing madly like a kite, his arms swinging out as if they were wings, shifting his feet almost too fast for the eye to see. With a whoop he squatted on the floor and tossed himself about like a golden bird, lighting everything around him with the glow of silk, shimmering and flowing in a stream of fire. Tsiganok danced tirelessly, oblivious of everything around him. If anyone had opened the front door then, I am sure he would have danced right out into the street, through the town, anywhere. "Give me some room," shouted Uncle Yakov, stamping his feet. He gave a piercing whistle and cried in a voice that grated on the nerves. If I weren't sorry for my shoes, I'd have left wife and children long ago. The people at the table began to fidget, and at times they too cried out, screeched, just as though they had been burnt. The bearded Grigory slapped his bald head and mumbled something. On one occasion he leant over to me, so my shoulders were covered with his soft beard, and said, right into my ear, as though he were addressing one of the grown-ups, "If your father were here now, Alexei, he would have kindled a different sort of fire. He was a kind man, and so full of life. Do you remember him?" No? Well, once he and grandmother... Wait a minute. He stood up, so tall and at the same time so thin that he looked like one of the saints in the icons, bowed to grandmother and asked her in an unusually deep voice, "Akulina Ivanovna, will you be good enough to dance for us? Like you used to with Maxim. Please." Grandmother laughed and shrank away. "Go on with you, Grigory. At my time of life, I'd be a laughingstock." But everyone started persuading her, and suddenly she sprang up like a young girl, straightened her skirt, held herself erect, tossed her head back, and walked round the kitchen shouting, "Laugh if you want to. It's good for you. Yasha, let's have some music." My uncle braced himself, closed his eyes, and played something a little slower. Tsiganok stopped for a moment, leaped over to where grandmother was squatted, and started dancing round her while she sailed over the floor without a sound, as if she were flying, her hands flung outwards, eyebrows raised and her black eyes peering into the distance. She struck me as very funny, and I burst out laughing. Grigory pointed a sternly threatening finger at me, and all the grown-ups looked at me disapprovingly. "Give her room, Ivan," laughed Grigory. Tsiganok obediently jumped to one side and sat by the door. Yevgenia, her Adam's apple popping up and down, began to sing in a deep, pleasant voice, all week long, until Saturday. A maiden wove her lace. The work tired her out. Now there's hardly any life in her. Grandmother seemed to be telling a story rather than dancing. She moved quietly, deep in thought, swaying and looking out from under her arms, her whole enormous body hesitating as her feet carefully felt their way. Suddenly, as though startled by something, she stopped. Her face trembled, became clouded over, and then, just as suddenly, was lit up by a friendly, welcoming smile. She tottered, as though she were letting someone pass and at the same time waving someone aside. She let her head drop, stood quite still, and seemed to be listening to something. Her smile grew gayer and gayer, and suddenly she whirled around impetuously, looking more graceful and taller than I had ever seen her before. It was impossible to take one's eyes off her, so wildly beautiful and enchanting had she become in those brief minutes when she had miraculously recovered her youth. And our nurse Yevgenia kept up her deep trumpeting. On Sunday, from early Mass to midnight, she danced. She was last to leave the street, and then it was Monday. When she had finished dancing, grandmother went to her seat by the samovar. Everyone applauded, and she said, setting her hair in place, "That's enough. Haven't you seen a real dancer before? When we lived in Valachna, there was a young girl, I forget her name now, who made people cry with joy when she danced. It really did you good just to look at her. And I was jealous of her. Singers and dancers are the salt of the earth. Yevgenia said seriously and began a song about King David. Uncle Yakov embraced Siganok and said, "You should dance in the pubs. You'd be a roaring success." "But I want to be a singer," complained Siganok. "If God gave me a voice, I'd sing for 10 years. And then go into a monastery." Everyone was drinking vodka, especially Grigory. Grandmother poured out glass after glass for him, and warned, "With all that drink you'll go blind altogether." Not dismayed, he answered, "What do I care? I don't need eyes anymore. I've seen everything." The drink had little effect on him, except that it made him more and more talkative, and then he nearly always started telling me about my father. He had a big heart, my old friend Maxim. Grandmother agreed with a sigh. Yes, God's own child. These facts about my father were all terribly interesting and kept me in a continuous state of excitement. They brought on a mild sadness that could never be exhausted. Sadness and joy lived side by side in people, almost inseparably, and one was always giving way to the other with a terrifying, mysterious speed. Once, when he wasn't as drunk as usual, Uncle Yakov began ripping the shirt he was wearing to pieces, furiously tugging at his hair, his thin mustache, his nose, and protruding lip. "What's the good of it?" he howled, tears pouring down his cheeks. "What's it all for?" He struck himself across the cheek, forehead, and chest, and sobbed, "I'm a lazy good-for-nothing, a lost soul." Grigory snarled, "At last you've spoken the truth." Grandmother, also under the vodka's influence, caught hold of her son by the hands and urged him, "Enough of that kind of talk, Yasha. The Lord knows best." When she was drunk, she seemed all the finer for it. Her smiling dark eyes spread a heartwarming light on everybody, and as she fanned her flushed face with a handkerchief, she said in a sing-song voice, "Lord, how good everything is. Why can't you see that? You only have to look around you." This was spoken straight from the heart, and was her motto throughout life. I was very shocked by my uncle's tears and shouting, as he normally took things as they came. I asked grandmother why he cried and swore and hit himself all over. "You want to know everything," she said, with a reluctance that was unusual for her. "It's too early for you to be poking your nose into these things." This aroused my curiosity all the more. I went to the workshop and started questioning Ivan, but I got nothing out of him. All he did was to laugh softly and look at Grigory out of the corner of his eye. Then he started shouting and pushing me out of the room. "Clear off and don't come back, or I'll dip you in a vat and dye you a different color." Grigory, who was standing in front of a low, wide stove with 3 vats cemented into it, was stirring the colors with a long black stick and every now and then took it out to inspect the colors dripping off the end. The fire burnt fiercely and its light was reflected on his leather apron, as brightly colored as a priest's vestment. Colored water hissed in the vats, sending off billowing clouds of acrid steam almost as far as the door. A dry wind blew outside in the courtyard. Grigory looked at me from under his glasses with his turbid, bloodshot eyes and said to Ivan gruffly, "Get some wood. Can't you see we're running short?" When Siganok ran out into the yard, Grigory sat down on a bag of sandalwood, beckoned me over to him and said, "Come and sit here." He put me on his knees, brushed his warm soft beard against my cheek and said in a way I shall never forget, "Your uncle beat and tortured his wife to death, and now his conscience is troubling him. Understand? You must try and understand everything, or else you won't get very far in this world. Grigory spoke simply, like grandmother, but at the same time he made me feel ill at ease. And he seemed to look right through everything from under his glasses. And how did he beat her to death? He said slowly. Like this, he'd lie down in bed with her, cover her with a blanket from the head downwards, and start pummeling her. Why? He doesn't even know himself. Taking no notice of Ivan, who'd come back with an armful of firewood. He squatted in front of the fire to warm his hands and continued. He may have beaten her because she was better than him, and he was jealous. The Kashirins, my boy, don't like anything that's good. They get envious and can't stand it and destroy it in the end. Just ask your grandmother how they wore your father to death. She'll tell you everything as it happened. She can't bear falsehood and doesn't understand why people lie. She's like a saint, even if she does have a drop now and again and her pinch of snuff. An angel of a woman. Mind you stick to her. He pushed me away and I went into the yard feeling dejected and frightened. Just as I was going into the house, Vanushka caught me up, seized me by the head and whispered, "Don't be afraid of him. He's all right. Look him straight in the eyes. He likes that." Everything was strange and very disturbing. I knew no other life, but had a dim recollection of my mother and father leading a different sort of existence. They spoke a different language, didn't enjoy themselves as we did, and were always close together, side by side. In the evenings they used to sit by the window, singing at the tops of their voices and laughing loud and long, so that people in the street would gather and look up. Their upturned faces absurdly reminded me of unwashed dishes after dinner. But with these people there wasn't much laughter. And when they did laugh, I didn't always understand what they were laughing at. Often they would threaten or shout at each other and whisper secretly in corners. The children were quiet and inconspicuous and seemed to be plastered to the ground, like dust after a rainstorm. I felt a stranger in the house, and my whole life there pricked me into being wide awake, suspicious, and very watchful of everything that went on. My friendship with Ivan grew stronger and stronger. From sunrise until late at night, grandmother was busy with the housework, and I had the whole day to follow Tsiganok around. When grandfather flogged me, he still put his arm in the way of the birch twigs, and the next day would show me his swollen fingers and complain, "I must be mad. It doesn't help, and look what I get as a result. I'm not going to do it anymore, so to hell with you." And with the next flogging, he would again suffer unnecessarily. "But you said you wouldn't do it anymore." "That's right, but I put my hand there. I didn't even notice what I was doing." I soon discovered something about Tsiganok which made my interest in him all the greater and deepened my love. Each Friday Tsiganok would harness to the wide sledge Sharap, our bay gelding, grandmother's favorite, a cunning rogue with a pronounced sweet tooth. Tsiganok dressed himself in a short fur coat which only reached his knees and a heavy-looking hat, and when he'd pulled his green belt tight, would drive off to the bazaar for the groceries. Sometimes he was a long time getting back. Everyone became worried, would keep walking up to the windows to look up the street, their breath melting the ice on the panes. "Can you see him?" "No." Grandmother used to worry more than anyone else. "Oh God," she would say to her sons and to grandfather, "You'll be the ruination of a good man and a horse. You should be ashamed of yourselves." Have you no sense of decency? Or not enough money for yourselves? A lot of grasping thieves. God will punish you one day. Grandfather would frown and mumble, "All right then, this is the last time." Sometimes Siganok didn't return until midday. The uncles and grandfather would rush outside, and behind them, furiously taking pinches of snuff and moving like a great she-bear, followed grandmother. For some reason, at this time of day, she seemed very clumsy. Outran the children, and then, amid rapturous scenes, sucking pigs, whole birds, fish and pieces of meat of every kind would be unloaded from the sledge. "Did you buy everything you were told to?" asked grandfather, gauging the contents of the sledge out of the corner of his sharp eyes. "Everything you asked for," Ivan replied gaily, leaping across the yard and loudly clapping his gloves together to warm himself. "Don't bang your gloves like that. They cost money," grandfather sternly shouted. "Any change?" "No." Grandfather slowly walked round the sledge muttering, "Looks like you've brought a lot of stuff back. Sure you've paid for it all? I won't have any dishonesty in this house." And he hurried away, his face wrinkled up. The uncles joyfully leaned on the sledge and started weighing in their hands the birds, fish, goose's giblets, legs of veal, and huge chunks of meat. They would whistle and shout approvingly, "He's bought very well." Uncle Mikhail was more enraptured on these occasions than anyone else. Like a coiled spring, he would jump round the sledge, sniffing at everything with his woodpecker beak, smacking his lips with relish, blissfully screwing up his restless eyes. He was thin, like his father, but taller and dark. Hiding his frozen hands in his sleeves, he started cross-examining Siganok. "How much did father give you?" "5 kopecks. But there's about 15 kopecks worth here." "How much did you spend?" 4.5. "Then you should have a half left. Notice how it all adds up, Yakov." Uncle Yakov, standing in the freezing cold with just his shirt on, quietly laughed and winked at the cold blue sky. "How about standing us half a bottle of vodka each, Ivan?" he said lazily. Grandmother unharnessed her horse. "What is it then? Feel like a bit of fun? Go on then. God won't mind." The huge Sharap would shake his thick mane, scratch at her shoulder with his white teeth, pluck the silk kerchief from her hair, look right into her face with smiling eyes, gently neighing as he shook the frost from his eyelashes. "Like a little piece of bread?" She stuffed a large, well-salted crust between his teeth, held her apron out like a sack under his mouth, and thoughtfully watched him eat. Siganok, playful as a young horse himself, pranced up to her and said, "That's a clever gelding you've got there, a fine horse." "Go away and stop wagging your tail about," cried grandmother, stamping her foot. "You're in my bad books today." She explained to me that he had stolen more than he bought at the market. If grandfather gives him 5 rubles, he'll spend 3 rubles and steal 10 rubles worth. He likes stealing. He tried it once and wasn't found out, and everyone laughed and praised him for his success, and after that it became a habit with him. From the time he was a young boy, grandfather had his full taste of poverty, and now old age has made him greedy, and money means more to him than his own children. He's only too pleased to get something for nothing. As for Mikhail and Yakov, she waved her hand and fell silent for a moment. Then she looked at her open snuff box and grumbled, "It's all as complicated as a piece of lace, Alexei, spun by a blind woman. You can't make out any pattern in it. If they catch Ivan stealing, he'll be beaten to death. After a short silence, she added in a soft voice, "Oh well. There's a lot of rules, but there's no real truth in them." Next day I pleaded with Siganok to stop stealing. "If you don't, you'll get beaten to death. They'll never catch me. I'm too clever for them, and I've a fast horse," he said, laughing, and then suddenly frowned, with a sad expression on his face. Of course, stealing is wicked and dangerous as well. I do it from boredom. I don't manage to save any money with those uncles of yours about. In a week they cheat me out of it. But I don't care. They're welcome to it. I don't starve." Suddenly he picked me up and gently shook me. "You don't weigh much, but although you're thin, you've got good bones. You'll grow up to be very strong. Why don't you learn the guitar? Go and ask Uncle Yakov. The only thing is, you're still a bit on the small side, and for your size you've a nasty temper. Don't you like your grandfather?" "I'm not sure. Apart from grandmother, I don't like any of the Kashirins. Only the devil could like them. What about me? You're a Peshkov, not a Kashirin. You've got different blood. You're a different breed." Suddenly he squeezed me tight and said almost in a groan, "If only I could sing. Then I would set the town alight. It's time I did some work." He dropped me onto the floor, put a handful of tacks into his mouth, and started nailing a width of wet, dark material onto a large square board, pulling it tight as he banged the nails in. Soon afterwards he was killed. This is how it happened. By the gates in the yard, leaning against the fence, was a large oak cross with a thick, gnarled stump at one end. It had been there a long time. I noticed it when I first came to the house. Then it was new and yellow, but the autumn rains had blackened it considerably. It had the acrid smell of fumed oak, and there was really no use for it in that dirty, crowded yard. Uncle Yakov had bought it for his wife's grave, and made a vow to carry it on his own shoulders to the cemetery on every anniversary of her death. This year the anniversary fell on a Saturday at the beginning of winter. It was frosty and the wind scattered the snow off the roof. Everyone had gone outside. Grandfather, grandmother, and the 3 grandchildren, before anyone else was up, had gone to the cemetery for the memorial service. I had been left at home as a punishment for being naughty. The uncles, both wearing identical knee-length black fur coats, lifted the cross and stood under its arms. Grigory and some man I hadn't seen before lifted the heavy stump after a struggle and placed it across Siganok's broad shoulders. He staggered and braced himself by setting his feet wide apart. "Think you'll make it?" asked Grigory. "I don't know. It's going to be hard." Uncle Mikhail shouted angrily, "Open the gates." "You blind devil." Uncle Yakov joined in. "Shame on you, Vanka. We're both thinner than you." But Grigory, as he swung the gates open, sternly advised Ivan, "Mind you don't do yourself an injury." "God help you, you bald nitwit," shouted Uncle Mikhail from the street. Everyone in the yard laughed and talked loudly to show how pleased they were that someone was taking the cross away. Grigory led me into the workshop and said, "If you're lucky, Grandfather won't beat you today. Looks as if he's in a good mood." Inside the workshop, he made me sit down on a pile of wool ready for dyeing, wrapped it round me up to my shoulders, and said pensively as he sniffed the steam rising from the vats, "I've known your grandfather for 37 years. I was with him when we started. And I won't leave him now. We used to be friends and started this business together, thought everything up ourselves. He's a clever man, your grandfather. He set himself up as boss. But I wasn't smart enough. God knows more than all of us, though. He only has to smile to make a fool of the wisest man on earth. You don't understand the why and wherefore of things yet. But before long you'll have to. It's rough being an orphan. Your father, Maxim, was a fine man. He understood everything, and that's why grandfather hated him and wouldn't recognize him as his son-in-law. I loved listening to those kind words and watching the red and gold fire flickering in the stove and milky white clouds of steam rising over the vats, leaving a dove-colored crust, like hoarfrost on the sloping rafters of the roof, where jagged chinks let through blue patches of sky. The wind died down, the sun came out, and the whole yard seemed sprinkled with ground glass. The screeching of sleighs came from the street, light blue smoke curled up from chimneys, and soft shadows glided over the snow as if they too had a story to tell. The tall, bony Grigory, hatless, with his long beard and large ears, looked like a kind-hearted magician as he stood there mixing the bubbling dye and continued the lesson. Never be afraid to look a person straight in the face. Even the dog that attacks you will run away then. His heavy spectacles pinched the bridge of his nose, making its tip turn blue, like my grandmother's. "What's that?" he said all of a sudden, listening hard. He pushed the stove door shut with his foot and bounded through the yard. I rushed after him. In the middle of the kitchen floor, Tsiganok was lying face upwards. Broad shafts of light came through the window, one falling on his chest, the other on his legs. His forehead shone with a strange light, and his eyebrows were raised high. Squinting eyes stared at something on the black ceiling. His dark lips trembled and blew out pinkish bubbles. Blood flowed from the corners of his mouth, across his cheeks, onto his neck and down to the ground. It flowed in thick streams from under his back. Ivan's legs lay in an awkward heap, and his slippers, clearly soaked through, were stuck fast to the floorboards. The floor had recently been scrubbed clean with sand and shone like the sun. Little rivers of blood ran towards the doorway, glinting fiercely where they crossed the rays of light from the window. Tsiganok lay motionless, and only his fingers, stretched out by the side of his body, moved and scratched at the floor, their dye-stained nails glittering in the sun. Yevgenia, our nanny, squatted by Ivan and tried to put a thin candle in his hand. But he couldn't grasp hold of it, and the candle fell into a pool of blood and went out. Nanny picked the candle up, wiped it on the corner of her apron, and tried once more to place it between his restless fingers. The kitchen was filled with whispers, which rose and fell like waves. It was like a gale which tried to tear me from the door, but I clung hard to an iron clamp. He tripped on something, Uncle Yakov said in a toneless voice, shuddering and twisting his head. All the color was drained from him, and he looked crumpled and disheveled. His eyes had lost their fire, and he blinked incessantly. He fell, and it crushed him, right in the back. We would have caught it, but we let go, just in time. "You killed him," said Grigory in an empty voice. "What are you talking about? You did it." The blood still flowed, and by the door it had collected into a dark pool which somehow seemed to be growing higher. Foaming pink at the mouth, Tsiganok bellowed, as if he were having a bad dream, and he became flatter and flatter. His body clung close to the floor and sank gradually into it. "Mikhail's ridden off to the church for father," whispered Yakov. I piled him into a cab and got back here as soon as I could. A good thing I didn't carry the stump, or I'd be in the same mess. Once more Nanny pressed the candle into Tsiganok's hand, and the wax fell with her tears onto his palm. Grigory said in a gruff, loud voice, "Stick it to the floor, near his head, stupid." "Yes." "Take his cap off." Nanny took his cap off, and the back of his head hit the floor with a dull thud. Then it rolled over to one side, and the blood flowed more abundantly. But only from one corner of his mouth now. It flowed for a horribly long time. At first I expected Tsiganok to rest a little, sit up, spit something out and say, "Phew, it's hot in here." He always used to say this on Sundays when he woke up from his after-supper nap. Now he didn't get up, but he just lay there, his life ebbing away. The sun had already moved away from him, and the bright strips of light had shortened and fell on the windowsills. Tsiganok had gone black all over, his fingers didn't move anymore, and the foam had dried from his lips. Around his head burnt 3 candles, their flickering golden spears lighting up his disheveled, blue-black hair. His blood-stained teeth and the tip of his sharp nose, throwing quivering yellow patches on his swarthy cheeks. Nanny, who was kneeling by him and weeping, whispered, "My angel, light of my life." It was cold in the room, and I hid under the table in terror. Then my grandfather, in his raccoon fur coat, burst into the kitchen, followed by grandmother, who was wearing her cloak with the little tails hanging on the collar, Uncle Mikhail, and a lot of strangers. Grandfather flung his coat on the floor and roared, "Bastards! Feel satisfied now you've killed him? He would have been worth his weight in gold in 5 years' time." The heap of clothes which they'd flung down on the floor blocked my view of Ivan. I crawled out and stumbled against grandfather's legs. He kicked me away and shook his red fist menacingly at the uncles. "Wolves!" He sat on the bench, propped himself up with his arms, and sobbed. In a grating voice he said, "I knew well enough. He was a spoke in your wheel. Poor Ivan, you weren't clever enough. What are we going to do now? Do you hear me? What have we done to make God treat us like this? Can you tell me, Mother?" Grandmother had flattened herself against the floor and was pinching Ivan's face, his head and his chest, breathing into his eyes and rubbing his hands. All the candles were knocked over. Then she wearily rose to her feet in her shiny black dress, opened her eyes wide and softly said, "Clear out, you bastards." Everyone except my grandfather left the kitchen. Tsiganok had a miserable little funeral, and there isn't much I can remember about it. Chapter 4. I lay on a wide bed, with a heavy blanket wrapped 4 times round me, listening to grandmother praying. She was kneeling, pressing one hand to her breast, and now and again she slowly crossed herself with the other. I could hear the frost crackling outside. Greenish moonbeams shone through windows covered with patterns of ice, lighting up her kind face and her large nose, kindling her dark eyes with phosphorescent fire. The silky shawl that covered her hair shone like forged steel. Her dark shifting dress flowed down from her shoulders and spread out over the floor. When she had finished her prayers, she began silently to undress, folded her dress with great care on the chest in the corner of the room, and approached the bed, where I lay pretending to be asleep. "I know you're awake. she said ever so quietly. "Stop pretending and let me have some of the blanket." Relishing the thought of what was to follow, I could not help smiling. Then she snapped, "How dare you play tricks on your poor old grandmother?" She took hold of the edge of the blanket and tugged it with such force that I was catapulted up into the air, turning over several times before I landed back on the soft feather mattress. She roared with laughter. "What's the matter, turnip head? Swallowed a mosquito?" Sometimes, however. She prayed so long that I really went off to sleep and didn't hear her get into bed at all. She always prayed for a long time after a day full of quarrels and aggravation. Her prayers made fascinating listening. Grandmother told God about everything that had happened in the house, down to the last detail. Massive, just like a mountain. She would kneel down and start off very quickly and in an unintelligible whisper, and then deepened her voice to a loud grumble. "As you know too well, God. Everyone wants the best of things. Mikhail, the elder, should really stay in the town, and he wouldn't like it if he had to go across the river, where everything's new and hasn't been tried out yet. I've no idea what will happen. Father has more love for Yakov. Do you think it's a good thing to love one child more than the others? He's an obstinate old man. Please, God, make him see reason." As she looked at the dim icon with her large, shining eyes, she instructed God, "Let him have a dream which will make him understand how to give himself to both his sons." She crossed herself, bowed down to the ground, banging her forehead against the floorboards. Then she stood upright again and said persuasively, "Why don't you let my Varvara smile once more? What has she done to annoy you? Has she sinned more than the others? Why should a young, healthy woman lead such a wretched life? And don't forget Grigory. His eyes are getting worse all the time. If he goes blind, he'll have to go begging. He's worked himself to the bone for grandfather, and do you think he'd help him? Oh God." For a long time she said nothing and let her head and her arms hang down, submissively, just as if she'd fallen fast asleep or suddenly frozen. "What else?" she said, and, suddenly remembering, wrinkled her face and said, "Save all believers. Forgive me, stupid fool that I am. You know that I don't sin on purpose, but only because I'm stupid." After a deep sigh she said in a warm, contented voice, "Dear God, you know everything that goes on." I liked grandmother's God very much, as he was so near to her, and I often used to ask her, "Tell me about God." She had a particular way of talking about him. She would speak very softly, with a strange drawl and her eyes closed. She always sat down at first. Then she would get up, sit down again, cover her bare head with a shawl, and carry on until I fell asleep. God sits on a hill, on a diamond throne in a heavenly pasture, shaded by silver lime trees that flower the whole year round. In heaven there's no winter or autumn, and the flowers never fade, but go on blossoming the whole time, so the saints can enjoy them. And around God fly hundreds of angels, like snowflakes or swarming bees, and they fly down to earth as white doves and then back to heaven to tell God all about us. There's my angel and yours. And grandfather's. Everybody has one. God treats us all equally. Say, for example, your angel reported back to God. Alexei poked his tongue at grandfather. God would order, "Let the old man give him a flogging." And he treats everyone according to what they deserve, whether it's joy or suffering. All is perfect harmony in heaven, and the angels rejoice, flap their wings, and sing, "Glory to you, God, glory," and he, dear, just smiles back at them. And she smiled herself as she shook her head. "Have you seen all this?" "I haven't seen it, but I know all about it," she answered pensively. When she talked about God, heaven, or the angels, she grew smaller and more gentle. Her face regained its youth, and her moist eyes radiated a particularly warm light. I took the heavy locks of her hair in my hands and wound them round my neck. All ears. I would sit quite still as I listened to her endless stories that never once bored me. Man can't see God. If he did, he'd go blind. Only the saints can look him full in the face. And I've seen angels too. You can only see them when your soul is pure. Once I was at early Mass and I saw two of them on the altar, like patches of mist, and you could see right through them. They were so shining bright, and their wings were like muslin lace and reached down to the floor. They moved around the communion table and helped old Father Ilya. When he lifted up his weak arms to pray, they supported them by the elbows. He was very old, blind as well, and was always poking his nose in everywhere. He died soon after. When I saw the angels, I nearly died from joy. My heart ached and the tears flowed down my cheeks. Oh, it was so wonderful. Oh, dearest Lenka, everything in heaven's so wonderful. And on earth too. Is it wonderful where we are? Grandmother crossed herself and answered, "Praised be Our Lady. Everything is wonderful." This rather disturbed me. It was hard to admit that everything in that house was wonderful. It seemed to me that things were going from bad to worse. Once as I was passing Uncle Mikhail's room, I saw Aunt Natalia, dressed all in white, her hand pressed to her breast, throwing herself about screaming, not very loud, but in a way that terrified me. "God help me, take me away." This prayer of hers I could understand. Just as I understood Grigory when he grumbled, "In the end I shall go blind and have to go begging. Even that will be better than staying in this place." I wanted him to go blind as soon as possible. I would have asked to be his guide, and together we should have gone begging. I had already mentioned this to him. Laughing into his beard, he replied, "All right, then, we'll go off together. I'll tell them in the town that you are the grandson of Vasily Kasherin, Master Dyer. It should be very amusing." Often I could see blue swellings under Aunt Natalia's empty eyes and the puffed-out lips on her yellow face. I used to ask Grandmother, "Does Uncle beat her?" "Yes, but on the quiet, the swine." Grandfather was against it, so he does it secretly at night. He's a wicked devil, and she's like a piece of jelly. Then she would tell me, the enthusiasm creeping into her voice, "All the same. Beatings today don't compare with those we used to get. Now it's only a question of a cloud on the ear or the teeth, or you get your hair pulled, but in my day we were tortured for hours." Once Grandfather beat me from the first day of Easter right from early Mass until the evening. He'd lash out, have a rest, and then start again, with leather straps or anything he could lay his hands on. What for? I can't remember. And then a second time he nearly beat me to death and made me fast for 5 days. I was lucky to get over that. I was numbed by this revelation. Grandmother was twice as big as Grandfather, and I couldn't believe that he could overpower her. Was he really stronger than you? Not stronger, but older. Besides, he's a man. To see her wipe the dust from the icons and clean the chasubles was both an interesting and a pleasant experience. The icons were very rich with pearls, silver, and colored stones along their edges. She would nimbly pick an icon up, smile at it, and say with great feeling, "What a lovely little face." Then she would cross herself and kiss the icon. "It's all dusty and covered in soot. Ah, Holy Mother, light of my life. Look, Lenya, the writing's so fine and the figures so tiny. But everything stands out clearly. It's called the 12 Holy Days, and there in the middle is the saintly Fyodorovna. And this one's Don't Mourn Me in the Grave, Holy Virgin." Often, it seemed, she played at icons like my crippled cousin Katerina played with her dolls, seriously and with deep emotion. Many times she claimed to see devils in large numbers or one at a time. One night in Lent I was passing the Rudolph's house. Everything was bathed in moonlight. Suddenly in front of me I saw something black sitting astride the roof, near the chimney. It was bending its horned head over the chimney and sniffing and snorting. So big and hairy it was, lashing away with its tail against the roof and scraping its feet over the tiles. I crossed myself and said, "Christ will rise again, and his enemies will be scattered." At this he gave a little squeak and somersaulted down from the roof into the yard. That got rid of him. The Rudolphs must have been cooking meat, and of course he caught wind of it and came to enjoy the smell, so pleased he was that it was Lent and they were eating meat. The thought of the devil rolling head over heels down from the roof made me burst out laughing. Grandmother laughed too and said, "They love getting up to mischief, like little children." I remember once I was doing the washing in the bath round about midnight. Suddenly the oven door blew open and out they poured, smaller and smaller, red ones, green, black, just like cockroaches. I made for the door but couldn't reach it. I got stuck in the middle of thousands of devils. They filled the whole bathroom so tight that you couldn't move, crawling under my feet, tugging at me and pressing up against me so I couldn't even cross myself. Just like kittens they were, all furry soft and warm. But they stood on their hind legs the whole time. They whirled and strutted about, showing their little teeth like mice. Their tiny eyes were green, and their horns were just coming through and stuck out like small knobs. They had piglets' tails. Oh, good Lord. I fainted clean away, and when I came to, the candle had almost burnt out, the water in the tub had gone cold, and there was washing all over the floor. You devils. I thought, go back to hell. When I closed my eyes, I could see a dense stream of hairy creatures, all different colors, come pouring out of the mouth of the stove and from the little pebbles round it, filling the bathroom, blowing on the candle and cheekily sticking out their pinkish tongues. It was both funny and horrifying. Grandmother shook her head and said nothing for a moment. Then she made another passionate outburst. I've seen lost souls as well. At night time, too, in winter, when a storm was raging. I was crossing the ravine at Dyakov where Yakov and Mikhail wanted to drown your father in one of the ice holes in the pond. Remember? Well, I was going my way and was just slithering down the path to the bottom of the gully when I heard such a whistling and whooping. There, in front of me, was a troika of black horses bearing right down on me with a fat devil in a red nightcap standing out like a piece of wood on the driving seat and driving them on with reins made from steel chains in his outstretched hands. There wasn't any path round the gully, and the troika, hidden in a cloud of snow, went straight over the pond. All the passengers were devils, and they whistled and shouted and waved their caps. I counted 7 troikas that flew past like fire engines. The horses were black as crows, and all of them were people who'd at one time been cursed by their parents. They provide good sport for devils, who ride them and drive them through the night to their different celebrations. It must have been a devil's wedding I saw. It was impossible not to believe grandmother. She spoke so simply and convincingly. But best of all were the verses she recited about how the Holy Virgin walked through this world of suffering. How she pleaded with the robber princess Yangalaykiva not to beat or rob the Russian people, about Alexei, man of God, about Ivan the warrior, her verses about the all-wise Vasilisa, about the goat pope and the divine godson, and those terrifying legends about Martha the mayoress, about Baba Ust, the bandit leader, about Maria the Egyptian sinner, about the sorrows of the bandit's mother. There was no end to the fairy tales, legends, and poetry she knew. Quite fearless of people or grandfather or devils or any kind of evil spirit. She was absolutely terrified of cockroaches, even when they were nowhere near her. She used to wake me up at night and whisper, "Olyosha, dear, there's a cockroach crawling over the floor. Kill it, for heaven's sake." Half asleep, I would light the candle and creep over the floor in search of the enemy. It usually took me a long time to find it, and often I didn't find anything. "I can't see it," I would say. But grandmother, lying motionless, would answer, hardly audible from under the bedclothes, "Yes, there is. Please, please find it. I know it's there." And she was never wrong. I would always find a cockroach somewhere not far from the bed. "Did you kill it?" "God be praised." "Thank you." With a sigh of relief, she would throw the blanket from her head and smile. If I didn't manage to find the insect, she couldn't sleep. I could feel her body trembling at the least rustling sound, there in the deathly silence of night, and I could hear her holding her breath and whispering, "It's by the door. It's crawled under the chest. Why are you so frightened of cockroaches?" I said. This made her reply sharply, "I can't understand what use they are, for the life of me. They do nothing but crawl about, and they're all black. God gave the lowest creature some appointed task. The woodlouse shows a house is damp. A bedbug means the walls are dirty. A louse means that someone's going to be ill. It all makes sense. But these things, who knows what evil power lives in them or what they're here for?" Once when she was kneeling, having one of her heart-to-hearts with God, grandfather flung open the door and said hoarsely, "God's really come to see us this time. We're on fire." "What are you talking about?" Grandmother cried, jumping to her feet. With heavy stamping, they both rushed into the darkness of the front parlor. "Yevgenia, take the icons out. Natalia, get the children dressed." Grandmother gave these commands in a firm, stern voice while grandfather softly howled, "Oh." I ran out to the kitchen. The window overlooking the yard shone as if it had been turned to gold. Yellow patches of light flickered and drifted over the floor. Uncle Yakov, in bare feet, was trying to put his shoes on. He jumped on them just as if the soles were alight and shouted, "It's Mishka's work. He set us alight and then left us to it." "Quiet, you dog," said grandmother, as she pushed him towards the door so hard he nearly fell over. Through the frost on the windows, the workshop roof could be seen burning. Inside its open door there was an inferno of curling flames. Its fiery red flowers blossomed without any smoke in the quietness of the night. Only a darkish cloud hung in the air without obscuring the silver flow of the Milky Way. The snow gleamed purple and the walls of the outhouses shuddered as though they were trying to reach the corner of the yard where the fire was blazing merrily, lighting up the broad gaps in the workshop walls and thrusting twisted flames through them like red-hot nails. Red and golden ribbons of fire swiftly ran along the dry planks of the roof and coiled round them. The thin clay, smoking chimney stuck out in the middle. A soft crackle and silky rustle could be heard at the window. The fire grew bigger and the workshop, now looking beautiful in the fire, resembled the iconostasis in a church and lured one on irresistibly. I threw a heavy sheepskin coat over my head, shoved my feet into someone else's boots and dragged myself out into the passage and then onto the front steps, where I stood stock still, blinded by the fierce light of the dancing flames, deafened by the shouts of grandfather, Grigory, and my uncle, and the crashing noise from the fire, and frightened out of my wits by the way grandmother carried on, with an empty sack thrown over her head, and with a horse blanket round her she ran straight into the fire and shouted, "The vitriol! Idiots! The vitriol will explode! Grigory, stop her!" howled grandfather. "She'll never get out of there alive." But grandmother, her hand shaking and the smoke coming from her clothes, had already emerged, bent under the weight of a flagon of oil of vitriol which she held in her outstretched hands. "Father, get the horse out," she said with a wheezing cough. "Take this thing off my shoulders. Can't you see I'm on fire?" Grigory snatched the smoldering blanket from her shoulders and, stooping low, began furiously shoveling huge lumps of snow at the workshop door. Near him my uncle jumped about with a chopper in his hands. Grandfather ran around grandmother, hurling snow at her. She threw the flagon into a snowdrift and rushed to the main gates, opened them, and said as she ran to meet the neighbors who came pouring in, "Save the barn. If the fire spreads to the barn and the hayloft, everything will go up, your own houses as well. Cut the roof down and throw the hay into the garden. Grigory, throw the snow upwards. What's the use of chucking it on the ground? Yakov, stop fussing and give these people spades and choppers. Dear neighbors, all work together and God will help us." She fascinated me as much as the fire. Lit up by it and appearing to be enveloped by the flames, she dashed around the yard, a figure in black, turning up everywhere at once, giving orders to everyone. Sharap ran out into the courtyard, reared up and knocked my grandfather over. The fire was reflected in his gleaming red eyes. The horse snorted and jibbed. Grandfather let go of the halter and leaped to one side. He shouted, "Hold him, mother." She threw herself under the feet of the rearing horse and stood in front of him, looking like a cross with her arms outstretched. The horse gave a mournful neigh and craned its neck towards her, squinting from the fierce light. "Now don't be frightened," grandmother said in a deep voice as she patted its neck and took the halter. "Do you think I'd leave you in this? You little mouse." The little mouse, 3 times her size, followed her meekly to the gates and snorted as it peered into her flushed face. Yevgenia brought the children out of the house, all wrapped up in blankets and wailing. "Vasily, I can't find Alexei," she cried. "Come on, get out of here," grandfather answered, shaking his hand. I hid under the porch steps so Yevgenia couldn't take me as well. The workshop roof had already collapsed. Thin, smoking rafter beams stuck out against the sky and glowed like golden red-hot coals. Inside the building, green, blue and red whirlwinds roared and crackled as they exploded. The flames surged out into the yard in broad ribbons of fire, flung themselves at the crowd of people standing in front of the great conflagration and shoveling snow onto it. The vats boiled furiously in the fire, and steam and smoke rose from them in a thick cloud. Strange smells wafted round the yard, making the eyes water. I climbed out from under the steps and stumbled right into my grandmother's legs. "Get out of here," she cried. "You'll get crushed to death. Get out." A horse rider wearing a brass helmet rode into the yard. His rust-colored horse was foaming at the mouth. He carried a whip in his hand, and he lifted it high, shouting in a menacing voice, "Make way." The bells rang out merrily, rapidly, and everything seemed bright and festive to me. Grandmother pushed me onto the steps. "Can't you hear? Get out of here." This time I had to obey her. I went into the kitchen, pressed my face to the window again, but could see no trace of the fire through the dark mass of people, only brass helmets among the black winter hats and peaked caps. The fire was swiftly trampled into the ground and put out with water. The police dispersed the crowd and grandmother came into the kitchen. "Who's that?" "Oh, you. Too frightened to sleep? Don't be afraid, it's all over." She sat by me, silently rocking from side to side. The quiet night and darkness had returned once more, and I felt pleased. But I was sorry about the fire. Grandfather came in, stood by the door and asked, "Mother, what? Get burnt?" "No." He struck a sulfur match, and its blue flame lit up his polecat face, all dirty with soot. He found a place for the candle on the table and slowly seated himself beside grandmother. "You'd better have a wash," she said, covered in soot herself and smelling acrid from the smoke. Grandfather sighed. "God's been kind to you. He's given you a lot of common sense." He stroked her shoulder and added, showing his teeth in a broad smile, "He only lets you have it for a short while, though. About an hour at a time." Grandmother also smiled and wanted to say something, but grandfather frowned. "We'll have to get rid of Grigory. He's to blame. There's no more work in him. He's finished. There's Yashka sitting on the steps crying, the little fool. You'd better go to him." She got up and walked away holding her hand in front of her face and blowing on her fingers. Without looking at me, grandfather asked, "Did you see it all, from the beginning? What do you think of your grandmother now? An old woman, broken down and worn out. Yet you saw what she could do." As for the rest of them, he bent down and said nothing for a long time. Then he stood up, snuffed the candle with his fingers, and asked me again, "Were you afraid?" "No, of course, there was really nothing to be afraid of." He angrily stripped his shirt off and went over to the wash basin in the corner. There, in the darkness, he stamped and shouted, "Fancy having a fire. Anyone who loses everything he has in a fire should be flogged publicly in the square. He's either a fool or a thief. If people followed my advice, there wouldn't be any fires. Off to bed with you now. What are you sitting there like that for?" I went away to my room, but that night I couldn't sleep. I had just lain down when an unearthly howling made me spring out of the bed. I ran into the kitchen again, and there, in the middle, stood grandfather, shirtless and holding a candle which trembled in his hands. Without moving, he scraped his feet over the floor and said in a wheezing voice, "Mother, Yaakov, what's that?" I jumped up over the stove and hid in the corner. The place was filled with the same uproar as when the fire started. The painful howling grew louder and louder, and broke in regular waves against the ceiling. Grandfather and uncle ran around as if they had gone out of their minds. Grandmother shouted to them to go away. With a heavy, crashing sound, Grigory crammed some wood into the stove, poured water into some cast iron pots, and walked around the kitchen nodding his head like a camel from Astrakhan. "First get the stove going," ordered grandmother. Grigory hastily began to search for kindling on top of the stove, brushed against my foot, and cried out in a worried voice, "Who's there?" "Ooh, you gave me a fright. You seem to be everywhere you're not supposed to be. What's going on?" "Aunt Natalia's in labor," he said in an indifferent voice as he jumped down onto the floor. I remembered that mother didn't shout like that when she had a baby. Grigory put the iron pots in a corner, climbed up to where I was on the ledge above the stove, took a clay pipe out of his pocket and showed it to me. "I've started smoking. It's for my eyes. Grandmother told me to take snuff, but I think I'm better off smoking." He sat on one side of the stove, his legs dangling, and looked down at the feeble flame of the candle. One of his ears and his cheek were smeared with soot, and his shirt was torn on one side. I could see his ribs through the tear. They were broad, like barrel hoops. One of the lenses in his dark glasses was broken and half of it hung out of the frame, revealing in the gaping hole it left a red, moist eye just like a wound. He filled his pipe with leaf tobacco, listened to the pregnant woman's groans, and muttered incoherently to himself like a drunkard, "Grandmother got burned all the same. How will she be able to deliver the baby now? Just listen to her groaning out there." They forgot about her in the excitement. The pains came on right at the beginning of the fire. The fright started her off. Men don't realize what women have to go through when they have a baby, and they've no respect for them. Remember, respect the weaker sex. Mothers, I mean. I dozed off, but was soon woken up by the terrible din of doors being slammed and the drunken shouts of Uncle Mikhail. Strange words came to my ears. "Open the altar doors. Give her some lamp oil mixed with rum and soot. Half a glass of oil, half of rum, and a spoonful of soot." Uncle Mikhail kept on nagging. "Let me have a look at her." He sat on the floor, his legs wide apart. He kept spitting on the floor in front of him and hitting it with the palms of his hands. It became unbearably hot over the stove, and I climbed down. When I came level with my uncle, however, he caught me by the leg and pulled me, making me fall and hit the back of my neck. "Idiot," I said to him. He jumped to his feet and swung me in the air, bellowing like a wild beast, "I'll smash you on the stove." I came to in a corner of the front room, near the icons. Grandfather had me on his knees, and he rocked me and muttered, "None of us will be forgiven, no one." An icon lamp burned brightly above his head, and a candle burned on the table in the middle of the room. The dull winter morning was already looking in through the window. Grandfather leant over and asked me, "Where does it hurt?" Everything hurt. My head felt wet and my body was heavy. But I didn't want to tell him, as everything around me seemed so strange. People I had never seen before were sitting on nearly every chair in the room. A priest dressed in purple, A gray-haired old man in military uniform who wore glasses, and many more. They all sat motionless, like pieces of wood, frozen in expectation as they listened to water splashing somewhere quite near. Uncle Yakov stood by the door jamb, stiff and erect, with his hands hidden behind his back. Grandfather said to him, "Take him off to bed." Uncle beckoned to me, and we tiptoed to Grandmother's room. When I had climbed into bed, he whispered, "Aunt Natalia's dead." This didn't surprise me. For some time now, she had cut herself off from everybody in the house and never came into the kitchen or ate with us at the table. "And where's Grandmother?" "There," Uncle answered, waving his hand and tiptoeing off in his bare feet. I lay in bed and looked around. Blind, gray, hairy faces pressed against the window panes. In one corner, over the chest, hung Grandmother's dress. I knew this very well, but now it seemed that something alive was there, waiting. I hid my head under the pillow and peeped out at the door. I felt like jumping out of the feather bed and running away. It was stuffy and the room was full of an oppressive, rank smell, which reminded me of the time Tsiganok died, and his blood flowed in rivers over the floor. Something seemed to be swelling larger and larger in my head, or was it my heart? Everything I had seen in that house ran through me like a sledge along a wintry street, choking and crushing me. The door opened very slowly, and into the room crept Grandmother. She shut the door with a nudge of her shoulder, leant with her back against it, and, stretching out her hands towards the little blue icon light, said in a soft, plaintive, childlike voice, "My poor hands, they hurt." Chapter 5 Towards Spring the uncles split up. Yakov stayed in the city, while Mikhail went across the river. Grandfather bought himself a large, interesting house in Polyevoy Street, with a tavern on the ground floor, built of stone, a tiny, cozy little attic room, and a garden which sloped down to a ravine thickly overgrown with bare, bristling willow shoots. "Very good for whips," said Grandfather, with a gay wink as we went together down the soft, thawing paths to inspect the garden. "I think I'll start teaching you the alphabet next, something it's time you knew." The whole house was crammed with lodgers. Only the top floor was kept free by Grandfather for himself and for when he was entertaining. Grandmother took up residence in the attic with me. The window overlooked the street, and if you leaned out over the sill you could see the drunkards in the evening, when there was a holiday. They staggered out of the tavern and tottered along the street, swearing as they fell. Sometimes they were flung out into the street like sacks, only to force their way back in again. The door would slam, its screeching hinges would make a dreadful grating noise, and a fight usually followed. All this was very amusing to watch from my attic window. Every morning Grandfather would ride off to his sons' workshops to help them get things going. He used to return in the evening, tired out, irritable and depressed. Grandmother would sew, cook and potter round in the herb and vegetable gardens, dash about the whole day long just like an enormous top driven on by an invisible whip, take her snuff, sneeze with evident relish, and say as she wiped her sweaty face, "Praised be God for evermore, we've found peace and quiet at last, Lexii. Thanks to the Holy Virgin everything's very peaceful now." But our life there didn't strike me as very peaceful. From morning till late at night the lodgers' wives bustled around the yard, and now and again neighbors would turn up. All of them were always rushing somewhere, complaining they were late, and were always getting themselves ready for something and calling out, "Akulina Ivanovna," greeting one and all with the same friendly smile and concern. Akulina would push the snuff up her nose with her thumb, meticulously wipe her nose and finger with a red check handkerchief, and say, "If you want to get rid of lice, you should bath more often and steam yourself with mint vapor. If the lice are under the skin, take a spoonful of purest goose fat, 3 drops of mercury, pound it all up 7 times in a small dish with a piece of china and smear it on. If you use a wooden spoon or a bone, you'll lose the mercury. And never use copper or silver. It's very harmful." Sometimes she would think hard and say thoughtfully, "My good woman, you'd better go and see Father Azaf at Petcheri Monastery. I can't solve your problem." She was a midwife, sorted out family quarrels and arguments, treated the children when they were ill, could recite The Virgin's Dream by heart so the women could learn it for good luck, and gave them advice on domestic matters. You can tell from the look of the cucumber when it's ready for pickling. As soon as they lose their earthy smell and get their natural smell back, take them and salt them. If you want good kvass, then you must insult it, make it angry. Kvass can't stand sweet things, so throw in a few raisins or some sugar. A small teaspoonful to a bucket will do. There's different ways of clotting cream. There's the Danubian and Spanish and even the Caucasian way. All day long I followed her around, whether she was in the garden or in the yard, or went off to a neighbor's house where she would drink tea for hours, telling her incessant stories. I felt as if I had been grafted onto her and can remember nothing else about that time of my life except the indefatigable old woman who never faltered in her kindness. Sometimes my mother would put in a brief appearance. She was proud and stern and looked upon everything with cold gray eyes, like the winter sun, and later she quickly disappeared, leaving nothing at all to be remembered by. Once I asked grandmother, "Are you a witch?" "Whatever next," she said, bursting out laughing and then suddenly adding in a serious voice, "How could I be a witch? Witchcraft isn't learnt in 5 minutes. Besides, I can't even spell, don't know, A from B. Your grandfather is the one for book learning, but the Holy Virgin didn't bless me with brains." And then she unveiled another part of her life. I was an orphan as well. My mother had nothing, and was a cripple. When she was still a young girl, her master did something to frighten her. One night she jumped out of the window from fear and hurt her side and shoulder. And from that time onwards her right hand, the one she used most, withered up, a fine thing for a marvelous lace maker. Well, she was no use to her masters now, and they let her go free. Then she had to fend for herself. But how can anyone live without their right hand? So she wandered about, living on charity. In those days people were better off and kinder. There were the wonderful carpenters and lace makers of Balakna. They made you feel proud. Mother and I used to wander through the towns in autumn and winter. But when the Archangel Gabriel waved his sword, winter was driven away and spring would come over the earth. Then we would go on further, wherever the fancy took us. We went to Murom and Urivets, and up the Volga and along the peaceful Oka. It's marvelous to be in the open in the spring and summer. The ground's warm and soft, the grass like velvet. The Holy Virgin has sprinkled the fields with flowers. It fills you with joy and leaves room for the soul to breathe. Mother was in the habit of half closing her blue eyes and singing so she could be heard high in the heavens. Her voice wasn't strong, but it was clear as a bell. And everything around her would stop still and listen, entranced by her. Dear God, it was good to be alive. When I was 9, Mother began to feel ashamed of taking me with her on her wanderings, and thought begging was such a disgrace that she settled down in Balakna. She'd dash from house to house, except on Sundays, when she begged at the church gates. While she was gone, I sat at home learning as fast as I could how to make lace -1 wanted to be a help to Mother. And if something went wrong, the tears would roll down my cheeks. In just over 2 years, mind you, I learned the art and became very famous over the whole town. If anyone wanted anything extra special, they'd come straight to us and say, "Come on, Akolia. Get those bobbins moving." And I was so glad. It wasn't like work to me at all. Of course, it wasn't that I was so good, so much as doing what Mother told me. With one hand, she couldn't do very much. But she made up for it by being a very good teacher, and a good teacher is worth more than 10 workmen. I was so proud and used to say, "You can stop going round begging now, because I can support you." Mother would reply, "Enough of that talk. All the money's being saved up for your dowry." Soon after, Grandfather appeared on the scene. And a remarkable young man he was, 22 and already a foreman bargee. His mother had singled me out, and she could see I was a worker and that I was a beggar's daughter, which meant I'd make an obedient wife. Well, she used to sell bread and was a wicked old woman, God rest her soul. Why should we remember the wicked? God has his eye on them without our interfering. He sees what they're doing all right, and the devil loves them. She would laugh with that warm laugh of hers, and it was funny to see her nose twitch. But her eyes, shining and thoughtful, would caress me and tell me more than ever words could. I remember one calm evening, I was drinking tea with Grandmother in Grandfather's room. He was out of sorts and sat on the bed without his shirt, his shoulders covered with a long towel. Every minute he wiped floods of sweat off his forehead, and his breathing was rapid and hoarse. His green eyes had gone dim, his face was swollen and purple, especially his small pointed ears. It was painful to see his hand shake when he reached for a cup of tea. He was in very low spirits and not at all his usual self. "Why haven't I got any sugar?" he asked Grandmother in the capricious voice of a spoilt child. She replied in a friendly but firm voice, "Honey'll do more good." Heaving a breathless sigh, he quickly swallowed his hot tea and said, "Mind I don't die on you. Don't worry, I'll look after you. Yes, if I died now, it would be like I never lived at all. Everything would be squandered. Stop your chattering and lie still." For a minute he said nothing and lay with his eyes closed, smacking his dark lips. Suddenly, as if someone had stuck a pin in him, he shook himself and started pondering aloud. Yashka and Mishka must get married as soon as possible. Perhaps having a wife and children to look after will tame them a bit, eh? He began running over all the names of the people in the town who had eligible daughters. Grandmother didn't interrupt and kept drinking cup after cup. I sat by the window and watched the sun set glowing over the town, turning all the windows of the houses red. Grandfather had forbidden me to go out into the yard or the garden because I'd been up to some mischief. Flying beetles hummed around the birches in the garden. The cooper was working away in the yard next door, and somewhere someone was sharpening knives. From the gully, which lay beyond the garden, came the noise of children scrambling around in the dense bushes. I longed to be free, and the sadness of evening poured into my heart. Suddenly, with a loud noise, Grandfather slapped a newish-looking book he'd taken down from somewhere against his palm and called out to me in a lively voice, "Well, now, cucumber ears, come here. Sit down, Kalmuck face. Can you see that letter? It's A. Repeat now, A, B, C. What's this one? V. Right? And this? C. Wrong. It's A. Look, this is D then E. What's that? G. Good. And this? D. Right? And this? A. Grandmother interrupted. You should be lying down, quiet. This is just what I need to take my mind off things. Carry on, Alexei. Grandfather put his warm, moist arm round my neck and poked at the letters across my shoulder, keeping the book under my nose. He smelt hot, of vinegar, sweat, and baked onion, which nearly suffocated me. He flew into a temper, made a hoarse, wheezing noise, and shouted into my ear, "People, earth," these words were well known to me. But the Slavonic letters didn't correspond to them. The letter E looked like a worm. The letter G made me think of the humpbacked Grigory. And the letter Y reminded me of myself with grandmother, while grandfather had something in common with all the letters. He made me slave for a long time over the alphabet and forced me to repeat the letters in and out of sequence. His warm passion infected me, and I broke out sweating as well and shouted as loud as I could. This made him laugh, and he would cough, clutch at his chest, crumple up the book, and say hoarsely, "Mother, he's a clever boy, isn't he? You plague from Astrakhan, what are you shouting about? You're the one who's shouting." I loved to watch the two of them, grandmother, her elbows on the table, and her cheeks propped up by her fists, would watch us, laugh softly and say, "You'll do yourself an injury by all that shouting." Grandfather would explain in a friendly tone, "I'm shouting because I'm ill." "What have you got to shout about then?" He would shake his wet head and say to grandmother, "Natalia was wrong when she said he had a bad memory. He's got a memory like a horse. Let's have some more, Snubby Nose." Finally, he would playfully push me off the bed. "That's enough. You can keep the book. Tomorrow I want to hear the whole alphabet without any mistakes. If you get it right, I'll give you 5 kopecks." When I reached for the book, he drew me to him again and said gloomily, "What did your mother have to leave you for?" Grandmother gave a start. "Don't say things like that." "I wouldn't have, but it makes me feel so bad. It has to come out sometimes. When I think of the mess that girl's got herself into." He roughly pushed me away. "Go and play, but not in the street, only in the yard or garden." As it happened, I had a reason for wanting to go into the garden as soon as I appeared on the little mound of earth. The boys from the street used to start throwing stones at me from the gully, and I loved to pay them back in the same way. "Toffee Snout is here," they would shout as they caught sight of me. Quickly gathering handfuls of ammunition, "Hit him." I had no idea what Toffee Snout meant, and therefore the insult was wasted. I enjoyed being one against many and seeing a well-aimed stone make one of the enemy run for cover in the bushes. The battles were quite harmless and friendly, and they usually ended without any bad feeling. Reading and writing came easily to me, and as I progressed, grandfather paid more and more attention to me and flogged me less and less. although, in my own opinion, I deserved to be flogged more than ever. As I grew bigger and bolder, I broke grandfather's rules and regulations far more often. But all he did by way of retaliation was to heap abuse on me or shake his fist. I thought that perhaps all the floggings I'd had before were undeserved, and once I mentioned this, prodding me gently under the chin, he raised my head, winked, and said in his drawling voice, "Way odd." Then he would add with a thunderous laugh, "You little heretic. Who are you to say how many floggings you should have? Who can decide this except me? Clear off." But then he'd suddenly seize me by the shoulder and ask once more, looking me in the eyes, "I can't make out if you're cunning or just simple." "I don't know." "Don't know? Well, let me tell you, it's better to be cunning. Simple-mindedness is the same as stupidity. Do you follow? A sheep's simple-minded. Remember that. Now go and play." Soon I could read the letters of the Psalter. We usually got down to this after evening tea, and each time I had to read a whole psalm. H-R-Y-I-S-T-H-E-M-I-N, I spelled out, running the pointer across the page, and asking out of sheer boredom, "Happy is he. Do they mean Uncle Yaakov? I'll give you a clip round the ear in a minute, then you'll soon see who's happy," Grandfather said with an angry snort. But I felt that he was only being angry from habit, for the sake of discipline. And I was hardly ever wrong. A minute later, Grandfather, who'd clearly quite forgotten I was there, would grumble, "When it comes to singing or dancing, he's just like King David. But in business, he's a venomous Absalom. A songwriter, a rhymester, a joker. Ugh. Merrily, merrily dancing and prancing. Dancing won't get you far." Well, will it? I stopped reading to listen to him and peer into his frowning, worried face. His screwed-up eyes seemed to look right through me, at some distant object, and they shone with a sad warmth, which told me that his customary sternness was about to melt away. His golden eyebrows shone, and the dye-stained nails of his thin fingers shone as he tapped on the table. "Grandfather." "What is it?" "Tell me a story. You get on with your reading." "Lazy good-for-nothing," he muttered, rubbing his eyes as if he had just woken up. "It's fairy tales you like, not reading the Psalter." I suspected that he himself preferred fairy tales to the Psalter, though he knew the Psalms almost by heart. Having made a solemn vow to read a portion aloud every night before going to sleep, just like the church cantor chanting the breviary. After persistent pleading for him to tell me a story, the old man softened up and finally gave in. "Oh, all right then. You've your whole life to learn the Psalms, but I'll soon be at God's judgment seat." He leant against the wool-embroidered back of the old-fashioned armchair and, pressing more and more heavily against it, he threw his head back, stared at the ceiling, and started telling me about the old days, about his father, in a soft, thoughtful voice. Once a band of robbers came to Balakna to strip the merchant Zaev's shop. Grandfather's father had rushed to the bell tower to sound the alarm, but the robbers caught up with him, cut him to pieces with their sabers, and threw him down from the belfry. I was only a small boy at the time, and I didn't see it and don't remember anything about it. I only began to remember things from the time the French came in 1812, when I was just 12. About 30 prisoners had been brought into Balakna. All of them were skinny and small and dressed in whatever they could find. Worse than beggars they were, shivering, some of them frostbitten and hardly able to stand. The villagers wanted to beat them to death, but the escort guard wouldn't let them. The garrison troops turned up and drove the villagers back to their homes. After that, there was no trouble and everybody got used to each other. The French were a quick-witted, clever lot, even cheerful. They used to sing songs. The landowners used to come down from Nizhny on their troikas to look the prisoners over. Some would swear at them, threaten them with their fists, even beat them. Others would talk kindly to them in their own language, give them money and all sorts of warm clothes. One old gentleman covered his face with his hands and burst out crying. "That wicked Bonaparte," he used to say, "has completely destroyed the French. There's something for you, a Russian, even one of the gentry, but a good man." He took pity on a foreigner. For a moment he would say nothing, his eyes shut, and would smooth his hair with the palms of his hands. Then he would take up the story again, taking care with every detail in his evocation of the past. In winter the snowstorms raged in the street, frost gripped the houses, and the French used to run up to our window, where my mother stood baking loaves, and they would shout and jump around, banging on the glass and asking for warm loaves. Mother never let them into the house, but pushed the bread through the open window. The French would seize them, all hot and covered with flour dust, and stuff them inside their shirts, right against their bellies. How they survived that kind of life will always be a mystery. A lot of them died of cold, the ones who were used to a hot climate and had never known frost. 2 of them lived in our bathhouse. In the garden, an officer and his Batman, Myron. The officer was tall and thin, all skin and bones, and went around in a woman's cloak which came down to his knees. He was very friendly, but he drank a lot. Mother used to brew beer on the quiet and sell it. He'd go and buy some, get drunk and start singing. He picked up some Russian and used to jabber, "Your country not white, black, wicked." He spoke Russian very badly, but you could understand what he was saying and he knew what he was talking about. He used to say the climate in the north of Russia was harsh, but that it got warmer down south along the Volga and beyond the Caspian you don't see any snow at all. And it seems to make sense to me. Nothing said about snow or winter in the Gospels, nor in the Acts, not even in the Psalms, and that's where Christ lived, down there in the south. When we've finished the Psalms, we'll go on to the Gospels. He would lapse into silence again, appearing to doze off. He seemed to have grown small again and sharp-edged as he squinted and looked out of the window, lost in thought. "Tell me some more," I would say softly, trying to bring him back to the story. "Well," he'd say with a start, "I was telling you about the French, wasn't I? Well, they're human beings and no worse than us sinners. They used to shout out to my mother, 'Madam, madam,' which means my lady. That madam would carry more than 100 pounds of flour from the chandlers. She was too strong to be a woman, and right up to the time I was 20 she could swing me round by the hair like nothing, and I was no featherweight. Now this Batman Myron loved horses. He would wander from yard to yard and ask if they'd let him groom the horses. This he had to do by making signs with his hands as he couldn't speak our language. At first everyone was afraid to let him touch them, as he was one of the enemy, after all, and he might make a mess of it. But afterwards the stable hands themselves used to call out to him, 'Come and help us, Myron I.' He would laugh, put his head down, and charge like a bull. His hair was almost as red as a carrot, and he had a big nose and thick lips. He was very good with horses and produced miraculous cures for them when they were ill. Later on he became a horse doctor here in Nizhny, but he went mad in the end and the men from the fire brigade beat him to death. Towards spring the officer fell ill with consumption and on St. Nicholas Day passed quietly away. He was sitting musing at the bathhouse window and there he died, his head hanging out of the window. I felt sorry for him and even had a little cry. He was a gentle person, and very often caught hold of my ears to whisper something in his own language that I couldn't understand, but which I knew was kind. You can't buy affection in this world. Once he started teaching me French, but my mother stopped him and even took me along to the priest, who had me flogged and complained about the officer. People were cruel then. And that's something you won't have to suffer. Others have suffered for you. Never forget this. Look what I went through. It was dark now. Grandfather seemed to have grown mysteriously bigger in the twilight, and his eyes gleamed like a cat's. About everything except himself he spoke softly, thoughtfully, cautiously. But when he was the subject he grew excited and boastful and talked feverishly and very quickly. I didn't like it when he started talking about himself. And neither did I like his incessant orders. Remember that. Don't forget it now. Much of what he told me I didn't want to remember, but without any instructions on grandfather's part. Many things stuck in my memory like painful splinters. He never told me any fairy stories, only about things that had really happened, and I noticed he didn't like questions. For this reason I kept asking questions like, who's better, the French or the Russians? How do I know? I've never seen what they're like in their own country. He would snarl angrily and then add, even a skunk is all right in its own burrow. And are the Russians good? In their own small way. They were better under the landowners. Strong as wrought iron they were. Now they're all free and they've nothing to eat. The gentry, of course, are a hard lot, but then they've a good deal more common sense. You can't say that about all of them, but if you come across a good gentleman, then you have to admire him. But some are idiots, like sacks, and they'll hold whatever you stuff them with. There's a lot of empty shells around today. At first sight, they look like human beings, but go a bit closer and you'll see they're not people but empty shells, with all the goodness inside eaten away. Nowadays, we must try to learn as much as we can, sharpen our wits, but there's no real grindstone. Are the Russians strong? A few. But it's a question of skill rather than strength. A horse is always more powerful than the strongest of us. But why did the French fight us? The war's the Tsar's business. And it's not for us to understand. But I shall always remember how he answered when I asked him who Napoleon was. He was a bold man who wanted to conquer the whole world, and he wanted everyone to be equal, no lords or civil servants, but simply a world without classes. Names would be different, but everyone would have the same rights, and the same faith. I don't have to tell you what nonsense that is. Only crabs are all alike, but fish are different. The sturgeon's no friend of the catfish, and the sterlet doesn't mate with the herring. We've had our own Bonapartes, Razin, Pugachev. I'll tell you about them some other time. Sometimes he would stare at me long and silently, his eyes opened wide as if he had just seen me for the first time. This I found very unpleasant. And he never spoke about my father or mother. Grandmother often used to join us in these conversations. She would sit quietly in one corner, out of sight. and after a long silence would suddenly ask grandfather in that caressing voice of hers, "Do you remember the good times we had when we went on a pilgrimage to Murom? What year was that?" After a moment's reflection, grandfather replied, taking great pains to get his facts right, "I don't know exactly, but it was before the cholera epidemic, when they were chasing those Olankans in the forest." "That's right. I remember how frightened we were at the time." Yes. I asked who the Olankans were and why they were being chased through the forests. Grandfather reluctantly replied, "The Olankans were just peasants on the run from the hangman. Or from factory work." "How did they catch them?" "How do you think?" "It was like boys playing in the street. Some of them ran away and others went after them. When they caught up with them, they whipped and flogged them. They even had their nostrils slit and their foreheads branded to show they'd been punished." "What for?" "It's hard to say who was in the wrong, those who did the running away or the ones who were after them." "Do you remember?" grandmother asked again, "the time after the Great Fire?" A stickler for accuracy, grandfather would ask sternly, "What great fire?" As they reminisced, I was completely forgotten. Their quiet voices blended so well, they seemed to be singing. And it was a sad song, about illness, fires, floggings, sudden deaths, clever swindles, holy idiots, cruel masters. "The things we've been through," grandfather muttered softly. "Do you think it's been a bad life?" said grandmother. "Remember that wonderful spring after I had Varia? That was in 48. The year of the Hungarian campaign, the day after the christening her godfather Tikhon was taken away, and he never came back," sighed grandmother. "Yes, never came back. Ever since then God's gifts began to flow into our house like water over a raft." "Ah, Ververa, that's enough, father." He looked angry and frowned. "Enough of what?" "Our children have turned out to be failures, whatever way you look at them. Where's all our strength and youth gone to? We thought we were putting everything into a strong basket. But God put a badly made sieve into our hands instead." He cried out, just as if he'd burnt himself, ran round the room bitterly complaining, cursing his children and threatening grandmother with his little bony fist. "And you were always on their side, the robbers. You which?" Roused to wailing and tears by these painful memories, he hid in the corner where the icons were kept, and he beat his thin, hollow-sounding chest with wild movements. "God, am I worse than anybody else?" He was shaking all over, and his moist eyes shone spitefully from a sense of outrage. Grandmother, who was sitting in the darkness, silently crossed herself and then, approaching him cautiously, began her exhortations. "Why torment yourself like this? God knows what he's doing. And are other people's children any better than ours? It's the same everywhere. Quarrels, arguments, chaos, and confusion. All parents wash away their sins with their own tears. You're not the only one." Sometimes these speeches would calm him, and he would wearily fall onto the bed without saying a word, while grandmother and I went quietly away to our attic. Once, though, when she went up to him with her soft cajoleries, he quickly swung round and cracked her on the face with his fist, making a crunching sound. Grandmother staggered back, her hands pressed to her lips. Then she straightened up and said softly and calmly, "You fool." She spat out blood at his feet. But all he did was to let out 2 piercing shrieks, raise his arms and shout, "I'll kill you if you don't go away." "Fool," she repeated as she went to the door. Grandfather flung himself on her, but without hurrying, Grandmother stepped through the doorway and slammed the door in his face. "Old cow," Grandfather hissed, his face red as a hot coal as he caught hold of the door jamb and scratched at it with his fingers. More dead than alive, I sat on the bench, hardly able to believe what I had seen. It was the first time he had struck Grandmother in front of me, and this for me was terribly degrading, and revealed a new facet of his character that I could never tolerate and which humiliated me beyond description. He kept standing there, his nails dug into the jamb, growing smaller and grayer, just as if he had been showered with ash. Suddenly he strode into the middle of the room, kneeled, and, unable to keep upright, slumped forward, brushing the floor with his arm. Then, suddenly, he straightened up, hit himself on the chest, and cried out, "Oh God!" I slid off the warm tiles of the couch by the stove as though I'd been lying on ice and fled. Upstairs, Grandmother was walking up and down the room rinsing her mouth out. "Does it hurt?" She went over to the corner, spat the water out into the slop pail, and calmly answered, "It's nothing. The teeth aren't broken, only the lips cut." "What did he do it for?" Glancing out of the window, she said, "Lost his temper. It's hard for an old man like him with the failures he's had. Off to bed with you now and forget all about it." I began to ask her about something else, but she shouted back at me with a sternness that was rare for her, "Am I speaking to the wall? Go to bed. You never do what you're told." She sat down by the window and sucked her lip, spitting every few seconds into her handkerchief. As I undressed, I watched her. The stars twinkled in the blue square of window above her head. In the street it was quiet and the room was dark. When I'd got into bed, she came over, gently stroked my head, and said, "Sleep tight, I'm going down to Grandfather now. Don't feel sorry for me, Angel, I'm as much to blame. Go to sleep." After she had kissed me and left me, I felt unbearably miserable. I jumped out of the wide, soft, warm bed and went to the window. As I gazed down into the empty street, I suddenly felt numb and helpless with a hopeless despair. Chapter 6, and once again something nightmarish happened. One evening after we'd had tea, when Grandfather and myself were sitting reading the Psalms and Grandmother was washing up, in rushed Uncle Yakov, disheveled, as always, and looking like a worn-out broom. Without saying good evening, he flung his cap into the corner and started talking very rapidly. To the accompaniment of wild flourishes, "Mishka's gone berserk, Father. He had dinner at my place, got drunk, and then went completely off his rocker. He smashed the crockery, tore up a woolen dress that was all ready for a customer, broke the windows, swore at me and Grigory. He's on his way here breathing hellfire and shouting, 'I'll pull Father's beard off. I'll kill him. You'd better look out.'" Grandfather, his hands resting on the table, slowly rose to his feet, and his face became one big frown round the nose, so it looked terrifyingly like a hatchet. "Do you hear that, Mother?" he screeched. "Coming to kill his own father. My own son. Well, it's time." He threw his shoulders back and started pacing up and down the room. Then he went to the door, shoved a heavy bolt into the lock, and turned to Yakov. "Do you still want to grab Varvara's dowry? Well, this is what you'll both get." He stuck his fingers under Uncle's nose, making him jump back from the insult. "Father, what would I want with it?" "You? I know you too well." Grandmother didn't say anything and hurriedly cleared away the tea things into the cupboard. "I came to protect you." "That's a good one," sneered Grandfather. "Thank you, son." "Mother, give this cunning fox something to hold, a poker'll do, or an iron. And you, Yakov Vasilyev, as soon as your brother breaks the door down, give him one, on my head, of course." Uncle thrust his hands in his pocket and slunk off to a corner. "If you don't trust me, trust," shouted Grandfather, stamping on the floor. "I'd trust any wild beast, a dog, hedgehog, but you. I know you got him drunk and put the whole idea in his head. Well, have a go with the poker. Anyone you like, him me." Grandmother softly whispered to me, "Run upstairs and keep an eye open for Uncle Mikhail. As soon as you see him coming down the street, come and tell us as quick as you can. Off with you now. And hurry." And upstairs I went, rather frightened at the thought that my drunken uncle was soon to arrive, but proud all the same at being entrusted with such a task. I craned my neck out of the window and looked down the street. It was wide and covered with a thick layer of dust, out of which large cobblestones poked like great swellings. It stretched away to the left, crossed a gully, and came out into Ostrosnaya Square, where the gray buildings of the old prison with its 4 towers stood solidly on the clay soil. For me, this imposing building had a certain melancholy beauty. To the right, 3 houses away from ours, was the broad expanse of Senaya Square, surrounded on all sides by the yellow block of the convict barracks and the lead-colored fire tower. At the top of the wide-eyed tower walked a watchman like a dog on a chain. The whole square was cut up by gullies, and at the bottom of one stood a greenish slime. Over to the right was the stagnant Duakov pond, into which, according to the tale Grandmother told, the uncles had thrown my father one winter right through a hole in the ice. Almost exactly opposite my window was an alley lined with little brightly painted houses. It finished up by the fat, squat church of the 3 Saints. If you looked straight in front of you, you could see roofs, just like overturned boats floating in the green waves of the gardens, worn by the storms of long winters and washed by the interminable autumn rain. The faded houses in our street were all covered with dust. They huddled close to each other, like beggars at the church door, and, like me, they seemed to be waiting for somebody, their eyes protruding suspiciously. There were few people about, and they walked slowly, just like pensive cockroaches in front of the fire. The stifling heat rose up to where I was sitting, and the nasty smell of onion and carrot pies, which made me terribly depressed, was heavy in the air. I felt weary, in some special way that I found almost unbearable. My breast seemed to be filled with hot, liquid lead, and it crushed me from within and threatened to burst through my chest and ribs. I felt as if I was swelling up like a blister, and that little room with its coffin-like ceiling made me feel cramped, hemmed in. And here he was, Uncle Mikhail. He was looking around the corner of an alley outside a gray house. His cap was pulled down over his head so his ears stuck out. He was wearing a rust-colored waistcoat, dusty boots that reached to his knee, and held one hand in a pocket of his check trousers, clutching his beard with the other. I couldn't see his face from where I was, but from the way he was standing, he seemed to be about to leap across the street and beat against Grandfather's door with his black hairy hands. I should have run downstairs to tell everybody he'd arrived, but I could not tear myself away from the window at the sight of Uncle crossing the street, cautiously, as if he was frightened of getting dust on his gray boots. Now I could hear the door creak as he opened it and the tinkling of glass. I dashed downstairs and banged on Grandfather's door. "Who's that?" he asked gruffly, without opening up. "You? Well? Been to the pub?" "Right. Back upstairs. I'm frightened up there. You'll have to lump it for a bit longer." Once more I went back to my window. It was getting dark. The dust in the street was piled deeper and blacker. Oily, yellow blotches of light appeared in the windows of the houses. From the house opposite came the sound of music, guitar strings singing sadly and sweetly. And there was singing in the pub as well. When the door opened, I could hear the tired, broken voice of Nikitishkin, an old bearded beggar with a burning coal instead of a right eye, and whose left eye was always shut tight. His voice was cut off like an axe when the door slammed shut again. Grandmother was envious of him, and whenever he sang she would say with a sigh, "What luck knowing all those beautiful songs." Sometimes she would call him into our yard. He would sit on the steps, leaning on a stick and singing and telling stories, while Grandmother would sit next to him, listening and asking, "What's that?" The Holy Virgin was in Ryazan, and the beggar would reply convincingly, in a deep voice, she was everywhere, in all the provinces. Imperceptibly, a wave of heavy drowsiness seemed to flow down the street and weighed down on my heart and eyes. How wonderful if Grandmother would come, or even Grandfather. What kind of person must my father have been for my uncles and grandfather to have hated him? And for Grandmother, Grigory and Aunt Evgenia to say such good things about him? And where was my mother? I had been thinking more and more about Mother, and made her the chief character of all the fairy tales and legends Grandmother used to tell me. The fact that Mother didn't wish to live in her own family made her loom larger and larger in my dreams. I imagined she lived at a highway and with a band of robbers who stole from rich travelers and shared what they got with the poor. Perhaps she lived in a forest in a cave, with good thieves, of course, and cooked for them and guarded the gold they'd stolen. Or perhaps she was wandering over the earth counting her treasures, like the robber princess Yangalaikiva, together with the Holy Virgin, who no doubt was continually exhorting her as she exhorted the robber princess, "It is not for you, greedy slave, to gather all earth's gold and silver. It is not for you, hungry soul, to conceal your bareness with the earth's goodness." And Mother would reply in the words of the robber princess, "Most Holy Virgin, pardon me, have pity on my sinful soul. I did not plunder for my own sake, but for my one and only son." And the Virgin, who was kind, like Grandmother, pardoned her and said, "Oh, Veryushka of Tartar blood, oh, you evil unbeliever. Now go your own way and tread your own path of tears. Do not touch the Russian people, but spy out the forest Mordvinian or chase a Kalmuk over the steppes." I was carried away into the world of dreams when I recalled these fairy tales, only to be woken up by the uproar and shouting downstairs in the entrance passage. As I leaned out of the window, I could see Grandfather, Uncle Yakov, and the pub landlord, and the comical Cheremis Melyan pushing Uncle Mikhail through the gate out into the street. He put up some resistance, but they kept beating him on his arms, his back and neck, kicked him, and finally sent him sprawling in the dust of the street. The gate banged to and the latch and bolt clattered as they were slammed shut. A crumpled cap was thrown over the gates. Everything became quiet. After lying still for a few moments, my uncle got up. His clothes were all torn and disheveled, and he picked up a stone and hurled it at the door. A hollow sound rang out, just like the bottom of an empty barrel. Some miserable-looking people crawled out of the pub, shouting and bellowing and waving their arms. Heads were poked out of the windows, and the street became alive with laughing and shouting. All this seemed like a fairy tale, fascinating and exciting, but at the same time unpleasant and terrifying. And suddenly everything vanished from my memory, as I am writing now, leaving silence and emptiness. On the trunk by the door sat grandmother, bent double, motionless and hardly breathing. I stood in front of her and stroked her warm, soft and wet cheeks. She didn't seem to notice and muttered gloomily, "Good God, did your stock of common sense run out when it came to my sons? Lord, please help us." I imagine that grandfather didn't live more than 1 year in that house in Polyevoy Street, from one spring to another, but during that time the house took on a new notoriety. Almost every Sunday the street urchins would run up to the front door joyfully announcing to everyone in the street, "There's another fight at the Kashirins." Usually Uncle Mikhail appeared in the evening and kept the house under siege and in a state of terror the whole night. Sometimes he brought 2 or 3 assistants, scruffy louts from the Kunavino quarter. They used to climb up from the gully into the garden and give full vent to their drunken ecstasy, pulling up the raspberry and blackcurrant bushes. On one occasion they smashed up the bathhouse and broke everything that could be broken: shelves, benches, kettles. They even tore the stove up from the floor, smashed some of the floorboards, and ripped the door out of its frame. Grandfather stood by the window, a threatening, speechless figure, and listened to them smashing his house up. Hidden in the darkness, grandmother ran round the yard pleading, "Misha, what are you doing?" And she was answered by a string of obscene and idiotic Russian oaths, whose meanings must have been incomprehensible even to the animals that spewed them up. There was no chance of being with grandmother at a time like this, and without her I was terrified. I went down to grandfather's room, only to be greeted with a hoarse shout, "Clear off! Blast you!" I fled up to the attic and stared out through the window into the murky garden and yard, trying not to let my grandmother out of sight. I was terrified they might kill her, and I cried out and called to her. She did not come, but my drunken uncle heard me and started abusing grandmother with foul language. One evening, which was very much like this in many respects, grandfather was ill and lay in bed rolling his head, which had a towel tied round it, from side to side and grumbling, "Is this what I've lived and slaved for, sinned for? If it weren't for the shame of it, I'd call the police and have them up before the governor in the morning. What a disgrace! But how can a father set the police on his own sons? You've said enough, old man, so lie still." Suddenly he jumped out of bed and staggered to the window. Grandmother caught hold of him under the arms and asked, "Where do you think you're going?" "Light a candle," he ordered, gulping noisily for breath. When grandmother had lit the candle, he took the candlestick and, holding it out in front like a rifle, shouted through the window in a loud, mocking voice, "Ah, Mishka, thief in the night, you mangy hound." Just then the uppermost pane in the window was shattered and half a brick landed on the table near grandmother. Missed, roared grandfather. And I wasn't sure whether he was laughing or crying. Grandmother caught him up in her arms, just like me, and carried him to the bed. Murmuring in a voice full of fear and trembling, "What you going on about, eh? If you went to the police, it would be Siberia for him. Surely he understands that, mad though he is." Grandfather twitched his legs and sobbed hoarsely. "I hope they kill him." From outside came the sound of roaring and banging. I took the brick and ran to the window. Grandmother managed to catch me and fling me into a corner. "Little idiot," she hissed. On another occasion, my uncle, armed with a thick stake, broke into the house from the yard and stood on the steps of the dark porch, beating on the door, behind which waited grandfather with a stick in his hands, 2 lodgers with clubs, and the innkeeper's wife, a tall woman with a rolling pin. Grandmother stamped about and pleaded, "Let me go and speak to him. Just one word." Grandfather stood up, sticking his leg out like the peasant carrying the spear in a painting called The Bear Hunt. When grandmother approached him, he silently shoved her away with his elbow and leg. All 4 stood there, terrified and expecting the worst. Above them burnt a lamp which hung from the wall and flickered, casting a dim, feeble light on their heads. I watched all this from the attic ladder, and I felt like carrying grandmother up with me. Uncle was furiously breaking down the door, and now it was hanging perilously, ready at any moment to come away at the top hinge. The lower was already broken off and made a horrible grating noise. Grandfather urged on his helpers in a voice that grated as well, hit him on the arms and legs, mind, but not on the head. By the side of the door was a small window, just big enough to get your head through. Uncle had already broken the glass in it, and now it had turned black, like a socket without the eye, with bits of splintered glass sticking out all round the edges. Grandmother rushed up to it, thrust her arm through it, and waved it around. "Misha, for God's sake go away," she shouted. "You'll be crippled for life. Get out of here." He hit her on the arm with his stake. I could see something very broad-looking flash across the window, immediately after which grandmother slumped down to the floor on her back, just managing to cry out, "Misha, get out of here. Run." "Was that you, mother?" wailed grandfather, frightening me out of my wits. The door burst open and my uncle jumped through the black opening only to be thrown backwards off the porch like a shovel full of earth. The innkeeper's wife took grandmother to grandfather's room. He soon followed her there, gloomily went up to her and said, "Any bones broken?" "Yes, I think so," she replied without opening her eyes. "What have you done with him?" "Leave off, won't you?" snapped grandfather. "Do you think I'm a wild animal or something? He's lying tied up in the barn. I doused him with some water." "Swine. Which one of us does he take after then?" Grandmother groaned. "I've sent for the bone setter, so be patient for a bit," said grandfather, moving close to her on the bed. "They'll be the death of us both. They'll send us to our graves before our time. Let them have all the money." "And Varvara?" They talked for a long time, grandmother softly and plaintively, grandfather angrily and noisily. Then a little hunchbacked old woman came in. Her lower jaw trembled. Her mouth was wide open, like a fish, and her sharp nose curved round into it over her upper lip. I couldn't see that she had any eyes, and she could hardly shuffle along, scraping her crutches along the floor. In her hand was a bundle which jingled as she walked. I thought that this was death in person who'd come for my grandmother. I leaped over to her and shouted at the top of my voice, "Get out." Grandfather roughly caught hold of me and hauled me off to my attic without any further ceremony. Chapter 7 IT did not take me long to understand that grandfather and grandmother worshiped different gods. Grandmother would wake up and sit for a long time on the edge of the bed combing her wonderfully long hair. With her teeth clenched, she would twitch her head and tear out whole plaits of long black silky hair and curse under her breath so as not to wake me. To hell with this hair. All matted into one lump asterisk. I can't do a thing with it. When she had somehow managed to disentangle her hair, she would quickly plait it into thick strands, hurriedly wash herself, snorting angrily, and then stand before her icons without having succeeded in washing away the irritation from her large face, all wrinkled with sleep. And now would begin the real morning ablution, which straightway completely refreshed her. She would straighten her stooping back, throw her head back and gaze lovingly at the round face of the Virgin of Kazan, throw her arms out wide, cross herself fervently and whisper noisily in a heated voice, "Blessed Virgin, remember us in times of trouble." She would bow down to the floor, slowly unbend, and then whisper again ardently, "Source of all joys, purest beauty, flowering apple tree." Almost every morning she would find some new words of praise, which made me listen to her prayers with even greater attention. Dearest Heart of Heaven, my refuge and protection, Golden Sun, Mother of God, save us from evil, grant we offend no one, and that I in turn be not offended without just cause. Her dark eyes smiled, and she seemed to grow younger again as she crossed herself again with slow movements of her heavy hand. Jesus Christ, Son of God, be merciful to me, poor sinner. For thine own mother's sake. Her prayers were always a service of sincere praise that came straight from her heart. She didn't pray long in the mornings. As the samovar had to be got ready, grandfather didn't keep any servants, and if grandmother was late with the morning tea, which had to be served exactly on time, he would curse her long and angrily. Sometimes he would wake earlier than grandmother, climb up to the attic, and, catching her at her prayers, would listen to her whispering for some time, disdainfully twist his thin, dark lips and growl at her later when they were having tea. "How many times, blockhead, have I taught you how to pray, and still you mutter in your own sweet way, like a heretic? God will lose his patience one day. Don't worry, he'll understand," answered grandmother convincingly. "He can understand whatever you say to him." Blasted Chuvash. Her God was with her all day, and she even talked about him to animals. It was plain that it was easy for everything to submit to this God. People, dogs, birds, bees, even herbs. He bestowed his kindness on all earthly creatures without distinction, and was close to all things. One day the cat belonging to the innkeeper's wife, a spoilt, cunning, fawning creature with a sweet tooth, smoky-colored fur and golden eyes, and the favorite of everyone in the yard, dragged a starling in from the garden. Grandmother took the tortured bird away and started scolding the cat. "You've no fear of God, you miserable wretch." The innkeeper's wife and the man who looked after the yard both laughed at this, but grandmother shouted furiously at them. "You think that animals don't know about God? Every living thing knows about God just as much as you. Don't you feel any pity?" As she harnessed the plump, mournful Sharap, she chatted to him. "Why are you so down in the dumps, my servant of God? Getting old, aren't you?" The horse would sigh and shake his head. "All the same." She didn't mention God by name as often as grandfather did. Grandmother's God I could understand, and he didn't terrify me. Yet it was impossible to tell a lie in his presence. That would have been shameful. All he aroused in me was a feeling of overwhelming guilt, and I never lied to grandmother. It was simply impossible to hide anything from this benevolent God, and I had no wish to do so either. One day the innkeeper's wife, after a quarrel with grandfather, let grandmother have the full force of her tongue, though grandmother had nothing to do with it, and even threw a carrot at her. "You idiot," my grandmother said calmly. But I was deeply hurt and decided to take revenge on the evil woman. For a long time, I tried to think up a way of inflicting the greatest possible pain on that red-headed fat woman with her double chin and eyeless face. From my observations of the civil wars waged by the neighbors, I discovered that they took revenge on each other by chopping off cats' tails, poisoning dogs, and killing cocks and hens, or by creeping into the enemy's cellar at night, pouring kerosene into barrels of pickled cabbage and cucumbers, or emptying casks of kvass. But none of these was drastic enough for me. Something far more impressive and terrifying was needed. And this is what I thought up. I waited until the innkeeper's wife had gone down to the cellar, and then shut the hatch and locked it over her, danced a dance of revenge over it, flung the key onto the roof, and rushed as fast as my legs could take me to the kitchen, where grandmother happened to be doing the washing. It took her some time to find out why I was so delighted, and when she did, she gave me a smack in the right place, dragged me outside, and sent me up on the roof after the key. Amazed at this reception, I silently retrieved the key and then ran off to one corner of the yard, from where I could see grandmother freeing the captive innkeeper's wife. Then both of them, laughing all over their faces, came towards me across the yard. "You'll get it from me," said the innkeeper's wife, threatening me with her plump fist, but still smiling benevolently with that eyeless face of hers. Grandmother took hold of me by the scruff of the neck and hauled me off to the kitchen, where she asked me, "What did you do that for?" "She threw a carrot at you." "So you did it for me?" "Well, what a nerve. I've a good mind to put you under the stove to keep the mice company. Perhaps that will knock some sense into you. A fine protector. If I told your grandfather, he'd flay you alive. Off to the attic and learn your lessons for tomorrow." The whole of that day she didn't say one word to me, except in the evening, when before saying her prayers she sat down on my bed and told me, in these memorable words, "Listen, Angel. And don't you forget, don't meddle with things that don't concern you. Grown-ups are soiled by life. They've already been put to the test by God. But you haven't. And you have a child's way of looking at things. Wait until God puts you on trial, touches your heart, shows you your appointed task and the path you must tread. Understand? And it's not for you to decide who should be punished. God will judge and give punishment where it's due. That's his business, not ours." For a moment she was silent, then she took her snuff, blinked her right eye and added, "Sometimes even God can't tell who's guilty." "But doesn't God know everything?" I asked in astonishment. She answered in a calm, sad voice, "If he knew everything, then people wouldn't do a lot of things. He looks down on us from heaven, and at times he has such fits of crying and sobbing. My people, my dear people, I'm so sorry for you." She began to cry herself, and without pausing to wipe her wet cheeks, went off to a corner to pray. From that time onwards, the God she worshipped became closer to me, and I understood him better. Grandfather used to teach me that God was all-seeing, all-knowing, and present everywhere. That he was a help to people in their daily lives. But he didn't pray like grandmother. In the morning, before standing in front of the icons, he would spend a long time washing himself. Then, when he was neatly dressed, he would carefully comb his red hair, put his beard straight, and after inspecting himself in the mirror, tucking his shirt in, and tying a black kerchief round his waistcoat, would carefully, almost stealthily, approach the icons. He always stood on the same knot in the floorboards, which looked like a horse's eye, and he stayed there for about a minute, his head lowered and his arms stiffened against his sides, like a soldier. Then, keeping his trim figure upright, he would say in an inspired voice, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost." I thought that the room became especially quiet after these words. Even the flies seemed to buzz with more restraint. Then he would stand, his head thrown back, his raised eyebrows bristling, and his golden beard stuck out at right angles to his face. In a firm voice he would read the prayers, just as if he were reciting a lesson. And his voice had an urgent, very distinct ring. "For the day of judgment cometh, when every man's deeds shall be made known." He beat himself gently on the chest with his fist and asked insistently, "Against thee, the one God, have I sinned? Turn away thy face from my sins." He rolled out every syllable quite distinctly as he read the creed. His right leg twitched, just as though he were beating time to the prayer. His whole body strained towards the icons. He seemed to grow taller, and at the same time thinner, slimmer, neat and spruce, and compelling. Thou who didst bear the great healer, heal the long continued terrors of my soul. I bring thee the groaning of my heart. Have mercy, O Mother of God. Here he would utter a loud invocation, the tears welling up in his green eyes. Let my faith be counted to me for good, O my God. And visit not upon me those works which find no favor in thy sight. Now he continually crossed himself convulsively and nodded his head like a budding ram. His voice reached a high pitch and was heavy with sobbing. Long afterwards, when I visited synagogues, I realized that grandfather prayed just like a Jew. The samovar had long been puffing away on the table, and a smell of hot rye cakes and curds wafted through the room. This made me feel very hungry. Grandmother gloomily leaned against the lintel of the door, her eyes cast down, and sighed. The cheerful sun looked through the garden window. Dew sparkled like pearls on the trees. The morning air smelled delightfully of fennel, currants, and ripening apples, but grandfather took no notice and still stood there praying, rocking and shrieking. Quench the fire of my passion, for I am base and accursed. I knew all his morning and night prayers off by heart and followed every word to see if he made a mistake or left out something. This happened extremely rarely, but when it did, I felt a malicious joy. His prayers finished, grandfather would say to grandmother and myself, "Good morning." We used to bow to each other, and finally we sat down at the table. At this point I would say to grandfather, "You left out sufficient this morning." Are you telling me the truth? He would ask nervously and apprehensively. Of course you did. You ought to have said, and may my faith be sufficient unto my need, but you left out sufficient. Well, I never. He would exclaim with a guilty wink. Later he would find some way of getting his own back, but until then I sat there triumphantly, reveling in his embarrassment. Once grandmother said jokingly, "Goodness gracious, God must be bored stiff hearing your prayers. Same old thing again and again."